Chapter 104, Mission Completed, Task Panel. Kate stared at the glowing system panel in disbelief. That's it? Really? This is what they call the ultimate deception? She'd assumed Mission 7 would be something momentous. After all, she'd spent the last few hours following Harry's exploits via the stream. Darkness had fallen outside her window, but she knew the exact time down to the second because the panel automatically records every mission update. All she'd seen was the Mission Refreshed notification, Harry's voice announcing progress, and then, instantaneously, Mission Completed. She'd missed the entire finale, including Ron's triumphant celebration. Kate huffed. Great, so poor Ron's glory just vanished in a flash. From now on, he might as well be invisible. Ryan, sprawled out on her bed, yawned and tossed a pillow at her feet. Mission 7 was never real, he said sleepily. It was designed purely to steer Harry's growth. His power is his foundation. Every task, every so-called obstacle is just a handcrafted lesson in using it. The more elaborate the setup, the finer he hones his skills. That way, he stops being both master and slave to his own magic. Kate crossed her arms and arched an eyebrow. All right, Mr. Mentor, what about Mission 8? Ryan cracked one eye open, a lazy grin forming on his lips. Now that, he replied, is where things start to get interesting. Is it really over? Kate clambered up beside Ryan and rested her cheek against his shoulder. You know what that talented wizard said, 7 is the most magical number, so it feels right to stop here. Ryan laughed softly and turned to press a quick kiss to her lips, hoping to keep her mood light. But Kate, having sparred with him more times than she could count, was immune to such tactics. She puffed out her cheeks and gave him a playful shove. Is that all you've got? That's the grand finale of Harry Potter and the Resurrection Stone? Grinning unabashedly, Ryan shook his head. Not by a long shot. But remember, it's already August 28th, and Hogwarts starts next Monday, September 1st. Do we really need the system to assign us more side quests? Harry watched their banter and couldn't shake a hollow feeling. Summer had slipped away in an instant. In reality, he'd enjoyed only 4 days of genuine rest. The rest of his vacation had been swallowed by system tasks, preparing for his engagement to Ginny and choosing a site for the new cemetery. Even though every decision was his own, every duty one he'd embraced wholeheartedly, he couldn't deny the twinge of melancholy settling in his chest. He felt a rush of relief. He really was a wizard, just like the rest of his family, and he'd never have to set foot in some muggle place like Stonewall High. If Aunt Petunia had her way and sent him there, he might as well have walked into a brick wall and knocked himself out. Instead, he had 4 more days at Hogwarts, thanks entirely to the mission that had just ended. He remembered that moment a few days ago, when after learning the true nature of a lie, his retinal display had flickered and refreshed. He'd expected to see Mission 8 appear. Instead, a simple notification popped up, Mission Complete. All he'd done was spend several months back on April 3rd, 1994, just before Easter, teaching Dumbledore and Grindelwald new routines. He had instructed each of them to vanish at predetermined intervals in order to train in isolation. And now, at the exact time agreed upon on Easter Saturday, he was to slip away from Hogwarts, cross over into the Muggle world, and make his way to the ruins of the Gaunt family home. Once there, his task was clear. Destroy the lingering Dark Lord's curse, absorb the remnants of Voldemort's fractured soul, extract the Resurrection Stone from its Horcrux shell, and perform the resurrection ritual. It sounded impossible, but his mission log said it was done. And with that unexpected success, he had earned these precious extra days. He glanced out at the castle grounds, felt the weight of what he'd accomplished, and silently prepared for whatever came next. All that remained was for Harry to return to Hogwarts and complete the final step of the resurrection ceremony, calling out his mother's name. With that weight off his shoulders, he spent the last few days of summer relishing every moment of a true break. On his final evening at the Burrow, Mrs. Weasley outdid herself with a feast composed entirely of Harry's favorite dishes. Roast chicken with all the trimmings, creamy mashed potatoes, buttered peas, her famous treacle tart, and, for the grand finale, a honey pudding so sumptuous it made everyone's mouth water. As they polished off the last crumbs, Fred and George put on a dazzling fireworks display in the garden. The night sky filled with bouncing red and blue stars for at least half an hour, laughter echoing from the kitchen as each glittering burst took their breath away. Once the fireworks faded, the family retreated indoors for steaming mugs of hot chocolate. With bellies full and spirits high, they said good night and headed off to bed, the burrow falling into a contented hush. Morning came much too quickly. Though they'd agreed to rise at the first crow of the rooster, there was still a mountain of packing and last-minute errands to run. Mrs. Weasley flitted up and down the stairs, muttering about missing socks and extra quilts. Fred and George careened past with trunks in hand, nearly knocking over Percy, who was still half-dressed and clutching a scrap of toast. Outside, as Mr. Weasley lugged Ginny's suitcase toward the car, a stray hen darted between his feet. He stumbled over it, arms flailing, and narrowly escaped tumbling headlong into the yard. After a final round of frantic farewells and a few gentle reminders from Mrs. Weasley to mind your step, they piled into the Weasley family car. Harry settled into the back seat, heart still full from a perfect summer's end, bracing himself for Hogwarts and the moment he would finally speak his mother's name. "This is the seamless stretching charm," Draco announced, tapping the Ford Anglia's trunk with satisfaction. With a soft pop, the boot expanded, swallowing 8 large trunks, 12 people, an owl, and even a mouse, as though the car were a portable room. Mr. Weasley beamed. "See? Without this charm, we'd never fit all of you in here." From behind him, Mrs. Weasley appeared, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You know, muggles are far cleverer than we give them credit for. You'd never guess at first glance how much space lies hidden inside." Ron wiped his sweaty brow and muttered to Harry, "Dad's definitely going to die when Mum finds out we're piling into the car like sardines." Harry just gave him a blank look. Once everyone was curled into every available nook and cranny, Mr. Weasley slid behind the wheel. The engine rumbled to life. Ron sighed dramatically. Back when it was illegal to enchant Muggle objects, Dad told Mum all this extra room was the result of Muggle engineering, nothing to do with magic. Mum really believed it. Mrs. Weasley shot her husband a mock-threatening glare, and he grinned back sheepishly. "All right, everyone," Mr. Weasley called out, easing the car into reverse. "Hold on tight, we don't want to miss our appointment." With a gentle lurch, the Anglia slipped out of the driveway, its enchanted panels whispering secrets of hidden space as it merged into the flow of late summer traffic. After dropping Harry and the others off at school and seeing you home, Bill, Charlie, and I still have to get to work. Mr. Weasley glanced anxiously at his watch, his tone pitched as casually as he could manage. He was clearly hoping to postpone the day's real ordeal until he'd finished his shift. Mrs. Weasley hesitated, her eyes flicking to the back seat where Harry, Ginny, Neville, Draco, Ron, Fred, George, Percy, Charlie, and Bill were all seated, chatting comfortably. Torn between her children, her household duties, and the looming task of teaching her husband a lesson, she reluctantly chose the first two. "Fine," she said, teeth clenched, "but we'll be home early tonight." Her tightly balled fists betrayed the anger simmering beneath her words. Mr. Weasley, eager to share in her victory, even if it was only partial, reached for the steering wheel to give it a pleased pat. At the last moment, though, he thought better of it. He started the engine instead and steered the car out of the yard. Everyone in the car stiffened at the sudden tension. No one dared relax, even when Mr. Weasley engaged the invisible booster and shot the car skyward, weaving between clouds. Not a single smile appeared. Each mile felt longer than the last, until at last King's Cross Station loomed ahead. 10 minutes, they told themselves. 10 minutes, and they'd all be able to breathe again. "It looks like the chapter text didn't come through. Could you please paste the full machine-translated chapter you'd like me to rewrite?" "Once I have the complete text, I'll turn it into a polished, idiomatic English version for you." Chapter 105, At King's Cross Station. Unlike the Weasleys, who were frantically hunting down stray socks and misplaced spellbooks, Ryan and his friends had no real reason to rush. Castle Smith was only a thought away. Returning to it was as simple as a blink, so they could have traveled with scarcely a bag between them. Yet Penello wouldn't hear of such carelessness. To her, preparing for Hogwarts was a ritual, not a chore. Even though Ryan could have, with a mere snap of his fingers, read their minds, folded space, and packed every trunk in an instant, Penelo insisted on doing it herself. She methodically crammed quills, parchment, robes, and cauldrons into her luggage, tapping each item in as though they were secrets being locked away. Old Jack, their devoted house elf, watched from the sidelines with a downcast expression. He privately judged her refusal to let him help as a failure in teamwork, but loyalty above all else bound him. The first law of house elves was absolute obedience, and his master's wishes came first, so he remained perfectly still, arms folded, offering nothing but silent support. 10 minutes later, Penelo finally stepped back, brushing imaginary lint from her robes. The last trunk clicked shut. At long last, Ryan spoke. "All right," he said, smiling. "Shall we?" With that, they turned toward the platform, ready to catch the scarlet steam engine that would carry them, and their carefully packed hopes, toward another year at Hogwarts. Kate, the wiry girl everyone teasingly called the monkey, grabbed both Ryan's and Penelo's hands and strode forward. A familiar gray haze enveloped them, and in the next instant they stood on platform 9 3/4, the bustling heart of King's Cross Station. Before them hissed the Scarlet Hogwarts Express, steam rolling overhead as witches and wizards bade tearful farewells to their children. "All right, you little imp, let's go," Kate called, releasing Ryan's hand to tug Penelo toward the train. But Ryan hesitated. Kate glanced back with a playful smirk. "Don't tell me you're going to hide behind that doppelganger trick again. Why don't you go spend some quality time with the new couple you bonded with? Penelo and I have far too much on our plates to babysit you." Penelo gave a brief nod of agreement and slipped into the crowd, boarding the train. Left standing alone, Ryan turned to watch as, through the barrier's faint shimmer, Harry and his friends emerged onto the platform. Their journey had begun. Neville, Draco, and Harry had briefly lost sight of the Weasleys in the crowd. Across from them stood Neville's Auror parents and his grandmother, cradling his toad. Neville's eyes were red. He almost fell into his mother's arms the moment he spotted her. Nearby, Lucius Malfoy, Draco's father, remained at a slight remove. Beside him waited Draco's betrothed, Pansy Parkinson, and the ever-loyal Crabbe and Goyle. Ever mindful of Malfoy propriety, Lucius maintained a formal distance, and Draco matched his measured bearing. He didn't rush forward like Neville. Instead, he approached slowly, each step cautious. Pansy, on the other hand, ignored all decorum. With a delighted laugh, she flung herself into Draco's arms. Meanwhile, Sirius Black made a beeline for the Weasleys. Seeing this, Harry let go of Ginny's hand and darted back to join his family, drawing smiles all around. Watching it all with rapt attention was Ryan. These tender reunions, impossible in the original timeline, were unfolding under his careful orchestration. He felt like a director entranced by his own film, especially with the grand, law-defying ceremony involving the god of death looming just ahead. What must Snape's face have looked like in that moment? And could Dumbledore or even Grindelwald really steel themselves and stay perfectly composed every time? As Ryan mulled it over, he couldn't help but laugh. The smug, taunting murmurs rippled through the crowd on the platform, mocking, wicked laughter. Of course, Ryan wasn't afraid to confront them. He simply preferred to remain unseen. Just as he always did, he'd vanished from their sight, melting into the throng until no one even noticed he'd been there. And with a private smile, that was exactly what he did. Inside one of the quieter compartments on the Hogwarts Express, Ryan sat between Hermione and Luna, pretending to be engrossed in a book. He shivered briefly, not from cold, but from relief. Having dispensed with his duplicate body earlier, he felt lighter, as if an invisible burden had lifted and left him refreshed, like a sudden burst of cool air on a sweltering day. On the opposite side of the train, Harry had just waved off Sirius's portkey. He joined Ginny and the rest of his friends, who were settling into their seats. Draco and Pansy were already aboard, exchanging amused glances. Fred and George had darted past in a blur. No one quite knew where they'd gone, though rumors swirled that they were off to track down Li Qiaodan. Must have slipped away before Angelina arrived, Ron speculated, rummaging in his trunk for a snack. They both fancied her, you know. Hermione raised an eyebrow. Then why did they leave their luggage behind? But Ron only shrugged. Knowing Fred and George, it's probably a prank in the making. And with that, the twins' abandoned trunks became merely another mystery to tuck away until term truly began. Bill and Charlie volunteered to haul the trunks off the train. Bill had been itching to wave his wand and let magic do the work, but when Charlie shot him a withering look, he shrugged, pride as a man dictated it, and let Harry and Neville lug the heavy chest instead. "Bloody hell," Ron grumbled, struggling with his own trunk as they passed through the packed carriages. He kicked himself for forgetting one thing. The house elves at Hogwarts would have handled all their luggage anyway. He could have just claimed a free seat, left the trunks to Bill and Charlie, and let the elves deliver his box to the dormitory by name. Too late now. At Charlie's insistence, they continued to the very last carriage, which happened to be empty. There, they stacked the trunks, secured Hedwig's cage on the luggage rack, and settled into 2 vacant seats. When the Hogwarts Express finally screeched to a halt at Hogsmeade Station, Harry and Ron climbed out onto the platform and hugged Bill, Charlie, and the rest of the Weasley family goodbye. Mrs. Weasley took Harry's hand, her expression solemn. "Be careful at Hogwarts," she warned, "and whatever you do, steer clear of anyone from Durmstrang. Their headmaster, Karkaroff, was a Death Eater." Mrs. Weasley sat at the head of the kitchen table, her gaze sweeping across her children. When she reached Ron, he frowned and asked, "What about Grindelwald? Isn't he dangerous?" "He's under Dumbledore's watch," Mrs. Weasley replied sharply. Ron hunched his shoulders. "Karkaroff's a slippery one. He betrayed his own colleagues to save his skin. With Voldemort about to return, who's to say he won't turn on us again?" Mr. Weasley, who'd been hovering anxiously nearby, seized on Ron's words. "That's exactly my point." He shot a pleading look at his wife, clearly hoping to diffuse her worries before they grew into a family crisis. Mrs. Weasley's clenched fists relaxed as she nodded, satisfied for the moment. Then she turned to Harry, her voice firm. "Potter, you're engaged to Ginny now. Promise me you'll protect her, no matter what." At that instant, Bill came trudging in through the doorway, sweat beading on his brow and arms full of gear. He stopped short, caught the tail end of his mother's demand, and called out, "Harry, promise her that, will you?" "Bill," Ginny exclaimed, cheeks flaming. "How can you say that?" Charlie grumbled as he set down his own load. "Brother," Percy snapped from where he'd been overseeing Percy's parchments. "You're going too far." Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, Ginny, and Charlie all shouted at once. Harry met Ginny's eyes. He drew a steady breath and said, "I promise, I'll protect her with my life." At once, Bill's stern expression melted into a broad grin. He strode over and embraced Harry in a brotherly bear hug. In that moment, it was clear. Harry Potter wasn't just Ginny's fiancé. He was part of the Weasley family. Chapter 106. Single dog. Neville Harry knew Bill's friendliness was fake. His damp, sweaty face said it all. As the station whistle blew and the platform staff closed the train doors, Ginny couldn't hold back. She whipped out her wand and aimed it squarely at Harry. "Whirlwind sweep," she exclaimed. "I can't believe Bill pretended to accept you. Just look at you, dripping wet." Harry barely flinched. He'd long since seen through Bill's act. What struck him as odd was the silence from Ron and Neville. He glanced at them, curious. Ron was the first to speak. "The Ministry must be swamped," he said. "Back in our day, Dad and the others always waited until the train actually left before disappearing. This time they just waved and vanished." He rubbed his chin in an uncharacteristic moment of thought. At that precise instant, the train lurched forward with a hissing puff of steam and rattling wheels. "Let's head back to our compartment and settle in," Neville suggested. Harry nodded. With his engagement plastered on every front page, he knew that if Bill and the rest hadn't cleared a path for them already, they'd have been swarmed by autograph seekers and reporters in seconds. They weaved their way back through a chattering throng of classmates, everyone eager to see one another again after a whole summer apart. Ron paused at the entrance to the Hogwarts Express, scanning the familiar rows of scarlet carriages. "Hang on," he muttered. "I haven't checked yet. What if Crumb and that Beauxbatons witch are on our train?" His face lit up at the thought of Victor Crumb, his sporting idol, and of Fleur Delacour, the girl who'd captured his heart. Neville let out a relieved sigh. Apparently, Ron hadn't overheard his earlier remark. Show-off that he was, Ron thrived on attention. Of the 4 friends, he was the one most delighted to be back among classmates. Harry and Ginny exchanged amused looks, knowing him all too well. Harry stepped forward, placing a hand on Ron's shoulder. "I just did a quick sweep," he said. "There aren't any unfamiliar faces here. I think the students from Beauxbatons, Durmstrang, and Ilvermorny must be arriving by other means. Let's head back to the snack trolley. Maybe they're selling something good." Ron's eyes dropped at once. "Oh, right," he mumbled, as if food had suddenly lost all its appeal. Harry raised an eyebrow in surprise. Even the prospect of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans or a chocolate frog couldn't tempt him. Ginny, however, looked on with a more understanding smile. She knew Ron's heart was elsewhere, and hoped his crush wasn't too disappointed. Together, the four of them moved down the platform toward the bright green trolley, the clatter of plates and the bustle of students fading behind them as the train prepared to depart. Pansy Parkinson sneered at Ron. "Honestly, have you already forgotten that you have a girlfriend? Draco saw us together just now. He knows I'm your date. Neville's single, but you're not." Neville, standing a few paces away, clenched his fists. "Can we just get back to our compartment?" Ron practically jumped at the invitation. He was the sort of person who'd jump at any easy compromise. If you asked to open a window, you might be refused, but if you threatened to tear off the roof, suddenly everyone was eager to oblige. Tonight, he'd rather slip away with Harry than fumble through more awkward flirtations or deal with Lavender's mercurial moods. Ginny rolled her eyes. "You could have pointed that out a lot earlier, you know." Harry caught Ginny's look and offered her a grateful nod. Then he ducked his head and fell in step behind Neville. The Hogwarts Express had just begun to pull out of the station. Most of the passengers were busy stuffing trunks, exchanging last-minute hugs, or debating the new rules for this year's tournament. Shielded by the crowd, Harry and his friends slipped unnoticed back into their compartment. As Harry closed the door, Hedwig let out a delighted chirrup, flapping her wings against her cage. From the corner of the trunk, Radford Harry's shy little owl popped his head out of a gap and hunkered down, relieved to be safely stowed away for the journey ahead. Neville crouched in the grass of the greenhouse floor, peering under a stray fern. Yet within seconds he'd spotted his toad, Trevor, scooped him up, and began giving him a gentle little bounce in his palm. "Got you!" Neville crowed. "Hide-and-seek champion." Harry exchanged a worried glance with Ron. He wasn't convinced Trevor was enjoying the game. Neville may adore his toad, but Trevor was still a toad, and Harry suspected he'd rather be left alone. "Neville," he ventured, "are you sure that's the right way to hold him?" Ron sprang to his feet, eager to show off. "Let me demonstrate," he said, fishing Scabbers out of his pocket. With one smooth motion, he stroked the rat's fur from crown to tail. Scabbers rolled his eyes in apparent contentment. Neville studied the gesture, then tried to mimic it with Trevor clutched in his other hand. Harry shook his head. Only Ron would seize a pet care moment to display his own expertise. And naive Neville, always so trusting, was convinced this would keep Trevor perfectly happy. Harry doubted it. If Trevor weren't rumored to have partial magical blood, Neville's doting attention might well have smothered him. For nearly half an hour, poor Trevor endured Ron's relentless death-roll spa, his little legs paddling and his pupils wide with protest. Even Hedwig, perched high above on a rafter, tucked her head under her wing at the spectacle, too shaken to hoot in alarm. Hermione nibbled the same bland nuts that owls always ignored, hoping the simple taste would steady her nerves. When Harry spotted his friend's pets getting tangled up in the snack box, he sprang to his feet. "Have you all handed in your Hogsmeade permission slips?" he asked, striding forward. Neville froze, a nut poised in midair, and Ron's little owl, Leaf, fluttered onto the edge of the box. Signed, "Are you kidding me?" Ron barked, waving a dismissive hand. "There's honeydukes waiting for us. Only a fool would skip that." His eyes gleamed as he launched into an excited monologue. "They've got every sweet you can imagine. Take those pepper puffies. When you eat one, you literally breathe out smoke. Then there are the chocolate balls oozing with strawberry custard. No, wait, the regular custard ones are amazing too, and sugar quills you can suck on during class, so it looks like you're pondering your next spell." Ginny rolled her eyes. "Haven't we already been? We even snuck into the Shrieking Shack, the most haunted house in Britain. And don't forget those giant ice cream spheres that make you float a few inches off the ground when you slurp them." Ron flopped onto the couch beside Harry, completely missing Ginny's exasperated look. And maybe this time we'll actually meet students from the other schools, he announced cheerfully. Ginny rolled her eyes. Ron rarely heard a word she said. He started rambling about the giant guardian trees at Castello Bruxo and Victor Krum's underwater task, then suddenly stopped himself. Speaking of foreign schools, he said, turning to Harry, the French, they absolutely adore their desserts, don't they? Before Harry could answer, Neville burst out. Ron, is Lavender your girlfriend? The room went quiet. Neville's face turned bright red. I mean, why else would you be so focused on French pastries? I'm the only bachelor here, and I'm trying to concentrate on befriending foreign students. Voldemort's coming back. This isn't exactly the time for romantic distractions. Ron sat up, frowning. No, Neville, you're missing the point. I want to win over the Beauxbaton students. They're brilliant at alchemy, and that'll be crucial when we face the Death Eaters. Neville blinked. Alchemy? Precisely, Ron said, his voice firm. We need every advantage we can get. And besides, he added with a teasing grin, Ginny was right. You'd do well to find a girlfriend yourself. Ginny glanced at him in surprise. Did she really say that? Ron beamed at her, smug and triumphant. Neville opened his mouth, then closed it again, utterly speechless. In that still moment, his thoughts drifted to a girl with rosy cheeks and 2 golden braids. Only the image flickered and vanished before he could place her name. Still, his heart skipped a beat. It looks like the chapter text didn't come through. Could you please paste the full machine-translated chapter you'd like me to polish? Once I have that, I'll be happy to rewrite it into smooth, idiomatic English. Chapter 1 and 7, Neville Who Endures Humiliation. Neville Longbottom leaned back on the padded seat of the Hogwarts Express, blinking blearily out the window at the rolling countryside. I hope we have potions first period, he muttered to himself. Ron Weasley, sprawled opposite him, shot Neville a horrified look. Potions? Neville, are you mad? You and I are practically Snape's personal targets. If it isn't Harry, it's one of us. Ginny Weasley, sitting beside Harry, sighed theatrically. She gave Neville a knowing smile. Remember, Neville, you don't have to take potions after 3rd year. You could opt for care of magical creatures instead. Ron's eyes widened. Hang on. Are you saying Neville might have a crush on someone in Hufflepuff? Who is it? Susan? Leanne? Hannah? Harry joined in, listing off the handful of Hufflepuff girls who'd ever exchanged more than a polite greeting with Neville. At first, Neville tried to protest, but as all 4 heads turned toward him, he slumped back against the compartment wall. I'm so tired, he mumbled, yawn halfway through. I hardly slept last night. And with that, he closed his eyes, feigning slumber. Ron poked him in the ribs. Oi, Neville, wake up, man. No response except a gentle snore. Ron exhaled in defeat, sat back, and stared glumly at the ceiling as the train carried them steadily toward another year at Hogwarts. Harry flipped through the pages of Seeing the Future Through the Mist and frowned. This book is so strange. Ginny peered over his shoulder. What do you mean? It's all baseless speculation, Harry grumbled. There aren't a single exercise in here for opening the third eye or strengthening your intuition. Ginny shrugged. Professor Ryan always said you can't teach someone to be a seer. Divination is a gift. Either you're born with it or you're not. Meanwhile, the Hogwarts Express thundered steadily northward. The rolling countryside outside their window grew wilder and darker as heavy clouds massed overhead. In the corridor, you could hear footsteps and quiet chatter as students made their way between carriages. Neville lay curled up on the opposite seat, snoring softly. Ron glanced at the compartment door, itching to find Lavender, but pride held him back. Worse, he knew Lavender's best friend Parvati still blamed him for that ill-fated prophecy, and he didn't want to make things awkward. With a resigned sigh, he reached instead for History of Magic. The Monster Book of Monsters had proven far too unpredictable, and most of his other texts were nothing but dry facts. History of Magic, at least, wound its lessons around a proper story. As the train sped on toward Hogwarts, Ron settled in, eager to lose himself in the past and forget the risks of the present. Harry had just finished rereading the latest issue of Doraemon Summoner's Kingdom for about the 5th time and was starting to feel a little worn out by it. He figured he'd give it a rest tonight and pick it up again tomorrow. Around 1 in the morning, the familiar chime of the midnight food cart floated down the corridor to their compartment. Ron peeked up from his copy of A History of Magic. "Neville, are you really asleep?" he teased, poking Neville's shoulder. When there was no response, Ron shrugged. "Yeah, he's definitely out cold." Harry stretched and climbed to his feet. Leaning close to Neville's ear, he whispered in a low voice, "Wake up, or I'll tell everyone you have a thing for Hannah Abbott." Before Harry could finish, Neville's stomach let out a desperate growl. Neville rubbed his midriff and blinked blearily at Harry. "How did you know I love those extra-large pot scones?" Just then, the compartment door slid open, and the same smiling witch with the dimpled cheeks, whom they'd only met twice before, peered inside. "Scones, anyone?" she chirped. Her cart was stacked not with pumpkin pies or known muggle goodies, but with a neat row of oversized pot scones instead. Ron gaped at Harry. "How did you know they were bringing scones tonight? You've hardly left our side." T grinned. "Lucky guess." He turned back to the cart. "One each, please, and make it 2 for me." Neville sat up straighter, eyes shining. "Me too, please." As the witch plucked the warm pastries from her cart, the 3 friends gathered eagerly around, their late-night cravings at last satisfied. When Sirius arrived, you only took a dozen steps toward him before turning right back, Ron teased, fishing a hefty gold galleon from his robes. "And look what I've got. Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, super bubble-blowing gum, chocolate frogs, licorice wands, and a whole row of those giant scones." The vendor, a witch with a sharp smile, leaned forward. "Just so you know, my sweets are available right here on the platform. My father even picked up one of those scones yesterday, Harry. Surely you noticed?" Neville chuckled, patting Harry's shoulder with his enormous hand. Despite his round, friendly face, the gesture felt like an affectionate bear hug. Harry winced, then managed a sheepish nod. Once the witch moved on, Ginny sat bolt upright and snapped the door shut. She turned on Ron. 12 silver sickles and a handful of nuts all told. Why the gold galleons?" Ron spread his hands in mock innocence. "I finally have some galleons in my vault. I thought I'd dazzle everyone with my generosity. Besides, remember how Harry whipped out half a dozen galleons and silver sickles on the train 2 years ago? I've been dying to get him back." Ginny raised an eyebrow. Neville grinned. Then Harry, eyes twinkling, clapped his hands. "All right, you lot, settle down. Since I'm the star of the party today," he paused for effect, "tonight's feast is on me." The trolley was yours, scones, sweets, and all, and for once, everyone agreed it was exactly how back to school ought to begin. Harry grinned, and, for once tempering his usual banter, drew Ginny into a warm embrace. He buried his nose in her fiery red hair, inhaling deeply. "Honestly, Ginny, how are you this good?" he murmured. Ginny's cheeks flushed. She'd never be able to come up with a snarky retort to Ron now, and for once, she didn't mind. After all, their easy chemistry explained everything. Physically, Harry was still a virgin, but in his head, he and Bella had explored every imaginable trick and technique more times than he cared to count. He knew exactly how to make Ginny feel cherished, probably even with his eyes closed. He caught himself before going too far. "Don't worry," he teased, flashing his green eyes at her. "I'm a gentleman, after all." He rubbed at his sore shoulders, smirking. Just then, Neville shuffled over, an empty plate in one hand. Harry sprang into action, scooping up a stack of freshly baked scones and pressing them into Neville's arms. "Here you go. Eat up, Neville. You look hungry." Neville blinked, staring at the towering pile of pastries. Is there any water?" he asked. He'd completely forgotten about the clear, spring-like water he could summon with a single spell, his go-to comfort after the duel, once he'd spotted the scones. Ginny laughed softly and ruffled Neville's hair. "Help yourself to as many as you want. Don't be shy." Harry leaned back, satisfied. Between Ginny's smile, Neville's eager appetite, and the lingering warmth of the embrace, everything felt right. Harry nudged Neville with an amused grin. "I've noticed you staring at my scones for the last 10 minutes. Go on, take one. They're far too good to just look at." Before Harry could finish speaking, Neville had already piled half a dozen scones onto his plate. 10 minutes later, he was choking, eyes watering, desperately gulping water from Ron's flask. Harry quietly passed him a fresh plate to keep the supply steady. "Thanks," Neville managed between gulps, crumbs spilling down his front. He wanted to complain about the mess, but thoughts of Hannah Abbott, the girl he'd been writing to all summer, stopped him in his tracks. He didn't want to lose his composure now. But Neville's grip on the plate was so fierce that his fingers sank into the soft pastry, tearing it apart. Ron laughed. "That's some appetite you've got there." Okay, no more," Neville wheezed, springing to his feet and yanking open the compartment door. "If I eat another bite, I'll explode." "Don't worry," Ron said, stretching. "I've got enough galleons to buy another tray at the next station." Harry chimed in. "Actually, I know exactly where Lavender Brown's compartment is. Ask the conductor at the front of the train. He'll point you right to her." Neville waved him off. "I'm good for now, thanks." He collapsed back into his seat with a contented groan. Ron cleared his throat and scratched the back of his neck. Actually, I was planning to see Lavender, too. We haven't met since, well, all summer. We've just been writing letters." His cheeks flushed pink with embarrassment. Really, he admitted to himself, he was just bored, any excuse to stretch his legs. The compartment door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment, the three friends sank into companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of chocolate frogs, long letters, and the promise of seeing someone special. With Ginny at his side, Harry scarcely gave him a second glance. Naturally, he turned instead to Lavender, his ever-reliable backup. Chapter 551, The Thief. Ron Weasley stepped out of the carriage, feeling anything but eager to see Lavender. It wasn't that he couldn't find her. Angelina Weasley had already told him 10 minutes earlier that Lavender and the Petil twins were sharing this compartment. But the news he overheard as soon as he slipped inside left him stunned. Lavender's voice trembled. "What am I going to do, Parvati?" "Krum actually wrote me a confession. He loves me." Parvati Patil sounded delighted. "Isn't that amazing, Lavender? Honestly, Ron never seemed right for you. We've been on this train for ages, and he still hasn't made any move." That offhand remark hit Ron like a curse. He couldn't bear to hear any more. His chest tightened, and head spinning, he backed out of the carriage and hurried away, heart pounding. Krum, the so-called thief, had stolen more than just Lavender's affections. In the original timeline, Victor had pined for Hermione, even though she already adored Ron, and then chased after Ginny, who was still close to Harry. If Harry hadn't been so stubborn, and if he'd stepped in sooner to cut off any chance between Krum and Ginny, Victor might have pursued Ginny as well. Now, here on the Hogwarts Express, Ron realized with bitter clarity that Krum's latest confession threatened everything Ron thought he knew about friendship, love, and loyalty. As the train surged through the night, Ron could only wonder how many hearts the Bulgarian seeker intended to steal next. Victor Krum stood in the crowded alleyway, his gaze drifting over the familiar faces of Hogwarts students. Hermione Granger and Ginny Weasley passed by, arms linked, and he let out an exasperated sigh loud enough for Harry, disguised that day as Ron's distant cousin, to hear. "Honestly," he muttered, "what's the point of being an international star if all the beautiful girls are already taken?" It was a curious complaint. As a celebrated Quidditch champion, Victor had never lacked admirers. Witches from every corner of Europe had chased after him. Year after year, he'd found himself at the center of a parade of suitors. Yet somehow, he always ended up pining for the one girl who was already spoken for. He would smile at Hermione when she laughed with Ron, feel a pang watching Ginny greet Dean, or like now, watch Lavender Brown whispering with Parvati Patil. It began almost as an accident, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Victor's heart went to those who belonged to someone else. Of course, this wasn't intentional, at least not at first. He merely noticed their warmth, their laughter, their luminous confidence in the company of someone they cared about. And every time, before he knew it, he'd fallen under the same old spell. Friends teased him gently, calling him a thief in training, since he only ever stole affections already tucked safely away. But as the years went by, Victor wondered if he might someday cast aside his manners and the moral hesitations that held him back, to claim what he truly desired. Here in Diagon Alley, that desire had turned his attention firmly to Lavender Brown. She stood with Parvati, browsing the latest cauldron designs, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Victor decided to tread carefully. Rather than approach Lavender directly, an obvious move, given his celebrity, He leaned on Parvati, thanking her for her honest opinions on the shops and asking her to pass along compliments to her friend. Lavender, of course, had no idea why the famous Bulgarian seeker was so eager to chat through a mutual friend. She simply smiled at every kind word Parvati relayed, delighted by the notion that Victor Krum might admire her taste. Unaware of his deeper motive, Lavender continued her afternoon of window shopping, flattered and unsuspecting, leaving Victor to wonder how long he could keep his secret infatuation hidden. Lavender Brown's best friend had always urged her the same thing: patch things up with Ron instead of letting their relationship fall apart. So when Victor Krum began sending her letters, Lavender deliberately kept her own romance under wraps. She told herself that Krum was simply curious, eager to learn about Harry, Hermione, and the others, and to practice his English. After all, each letter opened with "my friends, Harry and the others," so how could it be anything more? The idea that Krum might genuinely like her felt absurd. She was far too ordinary, and Victor Krum was a world-renowned Quidditch champion with admirers galore. Why on earth would he set his sights on her? Ron, of course, knew none of this. The moment he heard Krum's name, his sporting hero, he recoiled. Compared to an international star, how could he compete? Especially after hours spent side by side on the train, Krum hadn't even once come over to find her. So Ron retreated so swiftly that Lavender didn't even have a chance to explain. "Krum's completely unreliable," she called after his disappearing back, frustration and indignation mingling in her voice. "He knows I'm with you, yet he still confessed his feelings. Does he think British girls are that casual? That a quick confession from a Quidditch star is enough to make us swoon?" But Ron was already gone, and Lavender was left alone on the platform, the unspoken words hanging between them like ghosts. "He even calls himself Ron's friend. Disgusting!" Ron's heart pounded. He'd always figured Victor Krum was a bit of a rogue, but principled? Never in his wildest dreams. If he'd known Krum already had Lavender's affections, he'd have dropped his crush on her ages ago. The moment Ron slumped into the carriage, Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Ginny exchanged worried glances. "What's up, mate? Lavender dump you?" Ginny asked with sardonic glee. Ron didn't hesitate. He gave a short, bitter nod. Harry and Neville stifled the flood of questions on their lips. Even Ginny's triumphant grin froze. Her jaw practically dropped. She had spent weeks teasing Ron to pursue Lavender, convinced Lavender cared more for him than he did for her. And now everything had flipped on its head. Clenching his fists, Ron's voice was low and clipped. "It's Krum. He knows Lavender. He sent her a letter. He's confessed to her." Ginny's eyebrows shot up. "And did she say yes?" Ron shook his head, eyes fixed on the carriage door. "I didn't wait around to find out." Ron looked down, voice heavy with self-doubt. "But Parvati insists that Krum would be a better match for Lavender than I am." A bead of clear potion slid from his chin and splashed onto the carpet. Ginny, sitting beside Harry, had reached her limit. She gently pushed Harry aside and stood, eyes blazing as she faced Ron. "Enough, Ron Weasley. Don't you dare think Lavender is the shallow, vain girl you're making her out to be, because she isn't. Krum may be your hero, but not hers. We've all seen how he carries himself, and it's nothing like what a British witch would call dignified." She took a deep breath, pacing a step or two. "And Parvati? She's only speaking up because she cares, like any true friend would. She's worried you're not taking Lavender seriously. Lavender chose you because she wants to be with you for life. If I were Parvati, I'd say exactly the same thing." Harry, startled by Ginny's sudden fierceness, stumbled back. Neville exchanged a glance with Harry. Both thought there must be some misunderstanding about Krum's character, yet neither dared speak up. Ron swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Really?" Ginny met his gaze evenly. "Yes, really." Harry and Neville stepped forward in unison. "Absolutely," they echoed. Ginny crossed her arms, fixing Ron with a steady look. "So, Ron Weasley, is that clear? Go on. If you've still got any courage left, go talk to her yourself. Stop moaning here. And if Lavender really doesn't want you back, fine, I'll help you win her over again. Remember who you are, the son of the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Harry's best mate, the inventor of the mist bottle, and newly minted rich. Victor Krum's just a Quidditch player, and as Seeker, he doesn't hold a candle to awry." Ron gave a wry laugh. "But what if, What if I can't win her back? On the way home, I realized something. I don't love Lavender as much as she loves me. I only went to see her because I was bored. Yes, I'm her boyfriend, but I'm more comfortable with Harry than I ever am with her. Summer felt interminable, and all I did was write letters. Meanwhile, she's probably met up with Crumb several times, maybe even had a fling she'll never forget. Look around. Elphias Doge was with Dumbledore for 7 years, far longer than Lavender and I have been together. Yet on one summer graduation trip, Dumbledore ran off with Grindelwald, and Doge never married him. Compared to that, what are Lavender and I? Chapter 109. Lavender takes the initiative. The mid-afternoon rain blurred the rolling hills beyond the carriage windows into soft washes of gray and green. Inside the cramped coach, a heavy silence settled over the four friends. Harry Potter pressed himself into a corner, cheeks flushed. Ginny Weasley sat beside him, her slender frame poised protectively. Ron Weasley stared out at the sodden landscape, unconsciously tracing rivulets on the glass with his sleeve. Only Neville Longbottom, who'd wisely skipped lunch, seemed entirely sober. Moments ago, Ron had dropped a confession that left everyone stunned. "I know I'm Lavender's boyfriend," he'd admitted, voice tight, "but sometimes being with her just isn't as much fun as hanging out with you, Harry." Harry's heart thumped so hard, he was certain the others could hear it. He ducked lower, wishing for invisibility. Ginny's eyes flashed. She shifted closer, using her body as a shield against any stray barbs aimed at her brother. Ron sighed and finally faced them. "I never realized how much Lavender means to me," he said. "It's only now that I see I've taken her for granted." His voice broke. "But with Harry, everything feels so much more natural." Neville cleared his throat. "Why not ask someone, maybe a trustworthy classmate, to check on Lavender for you? See how she's taking all this?" Ron shook his head, frustration etched in the frown between his eyebrows. "No, I need to do this myself, and soon." He looked straight at Harry, vulnerability shining through the guilt. "Harry, would you come with me? Let's get off this carriage and walk. Talk this out properly." Harry met Ginny's gaze. Her fierce expression softened, and she gave him a small, encouraging nod. Gathering his courage, Harry stood and brushed rain-speckled raindrops from his robes. Beside him, Ron squared his shoulders as if bracing for the first honest conversation he'd had in weeks. "All right," Harry said, lifting his wand to light the footpath ahead. "Let's go." "Let's stop by Lavender's compartment and find out what's really going on," Ginny said, tugging Harry to his feet. She felt this was the perfect moment to get Harry away from Ron for a while. Once Ron and Lavender patched things up, Ron would have his hands full with his new girlfriend and wouldn't be worrying about Harry anymore. Harry nodded, relief washing over him. He, too, sensed the strength of Ron and Lavender's bond. Nothing short of Merlin himself could break it. Ron, still half asleep, mumbled, If Lavender really does choose Crumb, tell her I can't help her. I've always been immature. I never stopped to see how much she meant to me. Maybe I should just forget about it. Though truthfully, I doubt she'd want to hear that." "We're sure there's been a misunderstanding," Ginny insisted, glancing at Harry. "We'll sort things out with Lavender. Don't worry. We won't come back until it's all cleared up." Ron lifted his head sleepily. "So if you don't return, it means Lavender's chosen Crumb for good? Fine. At least I won't hear more bad news. I'm going to sleep now." He closed his eyes and instantly drifted off, just like Neville had moments before. An hour later, the Hogwarts Express continued its journey northward, the rain beating a steady rhythm on the windows. The window panes had turned a slick, slimy gray, their color deepening until the hallway lights and luggage rack lamps flickered on. The train lurched, raindrops pounded the glass, and the wind howled outside, yet Rowan Lou slept on, utterly oblivious. Inside the carriage, Neville Longbottom dared not utter a word. His mind was consumed by a single question. Had Lavender really fallen for Crumb? And why hadn't Harry and the others returned from the adjacent compartment? Neville's answer lay in two simple oversights. First, they'd forgotten to ask Ron which carriage Lavender was in. Second, they'd underestimated just how famous Harry had become in this timeline. Here, every wizard who'd heard of his deeds celebrated him as a genuine savior, and now he was freshly engaged. Before Evil could mull it over any longer, the sliding door swung open. There, in the narrow corridor, stood Harry, and at his side, Lavender Brown, surrounded by a jostling sea of admirers. The crowd pressed in, wands aloft, eager for a glimpse of the newly betrothed. "Harry," someone bellowed, "will you accept the England Quidditch team's offer? We've let off those smoke bombs nearly 100 times already. There's no better seeker, no one at all." Harry paused, canopy of cheering wizards closing in on him and Lavender. Rain still rattled the windows behind them, but in that moment, it was as if the entire train had become a roaring stadium, roaring for its champion. Harry and Ginny were still pressed shoulder to shoulder in the narrow corridor of the Hogwarts Express, barely able to move. All around them, a buzzing crowd of inquisitive witches and wizards demanded answers to the most outrageous rumors. "Is it true the entire Order of the Phoenix crashed your engagement party?" one eager fan shouted. "Did Mad-Eye Moody really lend you his magic eyes so you could see through walls?" Another piped up. "Are you summoning magical beasts now, like in Summon Kingdom?" a third asked, eyes wide. "I heard the Weird Sisters invited you to join their band," a lanky seventh year announced breathlessly. "And WWN says you'll host a live broadcast on September 7th, revealing your secret to flying so spectacularly. Is it true?" Somebody else even wanted to know if Harry had become a werewolf. "That's why you can fly so well, right?" Ginny squeezed Harry's hand protectively. He straightened, brushing aside stray strands of hair, and forced a polite smile. "No, none of it's true," he called. "I've never been invited to join the Weird Sisters, or the national Quidditch team, for that matter, and I certainly don't have Mad-Eye's magic eyes. I've never even heard of a show on WWN." A silence fell as everyone processed this. Harry continued, "All I know is that the Weird Sisters are just a band. Ludo Bagman used to play for the England squad before he got into trouble with gambling, and WWN stands for Wizarding Wireless Network, like a radio station, I think. That's all." The corridor erupted once more with questions, but Harry stood firm. With a shared glance, he and Ginny edged toward their compartment door, determined to escape the swirl of gossip and rumors before the train reached Hogsmeade. Harry Potter felt his heart sink. It wasn't just the Order of the Phoenix and Ron Weasley who knew about his astonishing summoning of a Pluto dragon. Soon, the entire wizarding world would learn of it. So far, no one understood exactly what new magical beast Harry had unleashed. Rumors swirled in hushed tones. The thought terrified him. His only small comfort lay in a recent shift of language. Nobody said werewolf anymore, preferring the euphemism wolf-wizard. If Professor Lupin's condition ever became public, at least the softened term might spare him disgrace and allow him to remain Hogwarts' Defense Against the Dark Arts instructor. Yet even that slender consolation did nothing to ease Harry's turmoil. Ron had just confessed his feelings to Harry under the mistletoe, and now Harry owed it to his friend to find Lavender Brown and clear up the misunderstanding between them. But as he stood amid the bustling crowds on platform 9 3/4, he froze, unsure how, or even if, he could walk away from his own worries to help someone else. "Excuse me, make way, please." Ginny Weasley's voice rang out as she forced her way through a throng of departing students. Harry followed her, determination kindling in his chest. "We're looking for Lavender Brown. Can anyone tell us which compartment she's in?" A familiar voice cut through the chatter. "Here I am. Ginny, over here." Relief flooded Ginny's face. She dashed forward and swept Lavender into a tight embrace. "Lavender, I've been searching everywhere for you," she exclaimed. Harry watched the reunion, feeling the first genuine flicker of hope in days. Soon, he thought, he would have the chance to set everything right. Lavender Brown burst free from the pressing crowd just as Hermione was about to give up hope. Heart pounding, she hurried back down the corridor toward their compartment. Once they were out of earshot, she began to explain how she'd met Victor Krum. When she'd finished, she stopped mid-sentence, frowning. "Honestly, that cad Krum claimed he already knew you," she said. "I was terrified he'd go straight to Ron and poison his mind against me. No wonder Ron hasn't come to see me. This is exactly why." Harry gave a sharp, awkward cough. Lavender shrugged. "After I thought it through, I decided I'd better track Ron down myself, and that's how I ran into you." Relief visibly washed over Harry's face. "That's such a relief to hear. Really, Ron isn't at all what you think. He did try to find you, only when he reached your compartment, He overheard Krum talking about pursuing you, and then he panicked. Ginny, who'd been standing nearby, let out an exasperated sigh. Lavender, you've got to understand, Krum's not just some famous Quidditch player, he's Ron's idol. The moment Ron thought Krum was chasing after you, he was horrified. He fled in shame. Honestly, he deserved every bit of running away. If he'd just knocked on your door and explained himself, none of this confusion would have happened. Lavender waved a hand dismissively. He's not Gryffindor enough for that sort of bravery, she teased. A Ravenclaw, I swear, will overthink everything. She tossed her hair back and managed a small, relieved smile. Her cheeks flushed with delight as she spoke, clearly overjoyed that Ron cared about her. Chapter 553, A Strange Riddle, and Dumbledore feelings are impossible to control. Neville fell in love with the girl on the Iron Throne the moment he laid eyes on her. Lavender Brown became infatuated with Ron Weasley in an instant. Ryan thought Ron was the luckiest fellow alive. Lavender was kind, devoted, and everything you could hope for in a girlfriend. Without her, Ryan joked that under his occasional hypnotic nudges, Ron might have ended up a curious bisexual, torn between girls and Harry himself. This time, however, Ryan hadn't influenced Victor Krum's heart, and he certainly never expected Krum to fall head over heels for Lavender at first sight, just as the original timelines Krum had with Hermione. Clearly, Krum and Ron were destined to clash. Ryan had been bracing himself to cook up 100 schemes to steer Krum back toward Hermione, only to discover the world had its own plans. In Ryan's eyes, that made Krum extraordinarily fortunate, and poor Ron all the more unlucky. Despite Krum's uncanny tendency to become besotted with other men's girlfriends, he was unfailingly loyal. Once he gave his heart to a witch, no other beauty ever crossed his mind again. If Victor Krum doesn't realize Hermione already has a boyfriend, just as in the original timeline, he'll simply turn his attention elsewhere. The real problem, though, is that Lavender now believes Krum does know about her relationship. After she and Parvati talked it over, their own assumptions grew until they were absolutely convinced of it. And even if they cornered Ron to clear things up, it's unlikely they'd bring up whether Krum is aware she's spoken for. Short of bumping into Krum again in person, or Lavender writing him a scathing letter accusing him of flirting with another girl, this misunderstanding will only deepen. Poor Ron will stay tormented. His greatest weakness has always been his insecurity. No matter how much he achieves, the neglect he endured as a child still casts a long shadow over his confidence. Harry noticed the change in him as they rode the Hogwarts Express. Once the truth had come out, Ron managed to force a smile, but his cheeks remained chalky white. Were it not for that unmistakable mop of red hair and those freckles, you might have sworn he was a Malfoy. It wasn't until the train screeched into the station that color finally returned to his face. The relentless rain had turned the morning's arrival at Hogwarts into utter chaos. Disembarking from the Hogwarts Express was a comedy of errors. Owls hooted insistently from their cages, stray cats darted across the ice-slick platform, mewing for scraps, and Trevor, Neville Longbottom's pet toad, croaked insistently from beneath Neville's battered hat. The wooden planks underfoot were glazed with ice, and sheets of cold rain cut through robes and cloaks alike. From his seat at the far end of the carriage, Ryan watched Hermione Granger and Luna Lovegood shiver beside him and raised an eyebrow. He'd expected a sudden drop in temperature to herald something sinister. After all, in the original timeline, Dementors had frozen the platform when Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, but today's chill clearly had no dark side explanation. Shaking his head, Ryan flicked his wand. A thin, silvery mist curled around him, Hermione and Luna, and in the next heartbeat, they vanished from the crowded platform. They reappeared in the vast, silent expanse of the Great Hall, its enchanted ceiling mirroring the stormy sky outside. Below them, every long house table stood empty, no sea of pointed black hats, no excited chatter. Only Professors McGonagall, Hagrid, Dumbledore, and a handful of colleagues sat quietly at the staff table, their eyes fixed on the great doors where the first years would soon enter. Despite Hermione and Luna's open curiosity, no one, Ravenclaw students or staff, seemed to notice the three newcomers who had materialized at the Ravenclaw table moments ago. Hermione paused, scanning the great hall. Then she turned to Ryan and called out, her voice carrying without a trace of inhibition. Are 3 more long tables down there. Are those for the other 3 schools? But where are their professors at the staff table? Ryan, you said teachers from other schools would be here. Except for Beauxbatons, there's no one. The representative from Castrumbush is just some tree shepherd, and the Durmstrang students went straight on to Grindelwald. Why aren't they here? And what about those wolf wizards who studied here all summer? Didn't they leave before term started? And isn't Filch's girlfriend still around? She and Ron have been writing letters non-stop, more diligently than Lavender ever did. Luna sat quietly to one side, her eyes flicking between the staff table and Hermione's bold outburst. She wondered if any wizard could pierce the wards Ryan had so carefully laid over the proceedings. Did Dumbledore, or Professor Riddle, the Horcrux of Voldemort now walking around as a teacher, really have no clue what was going on? Ryan, however, simply met Hermione's barrage of questions with a calm, almost indulgent expression. By now, he was used to her relentless curiosity, and truth be told, he'd come prepared to answer almost anything she threw his way. Hermione fired off a dozen questions at once. He raised an eyebrow and answered calmly. They're from the 3 sister schools. Their professors went home briefly to marshal their headmasters and students, then return in force to display each school's culture and magical prowess. The werewolf wizards did exactly the same thing. And so did Filch's girlfriend, Miss Campbell. She's actually been spending a lot of time talking to Ron. Apparently their personalities click perfectly. If you look past appearances, she might as well be a female Ron, only more self-assured. So when you meet someone who feels like an alternate version of yourself, it's only natural you'd get along better than with Lavender, right? Hermione stared at him in disbelief. A female Ron? Her mind, ordered and exacting, much like Professor McGonagall's, couldn't wrap around the idea. Filch attracted to Ron? It sounded impossible. He leaned back and added, "By the way, it seems neither Professor Dumbledore nor Professor Riddle is paying us much attention. Though Riddle is something else. There's a certain nobility to him. Almost like a human unicorn." "Professor Dumbledore," Luna said softly from the side, her voice almost reverent. "He seems so lonely, undeniably lonely." Ryan gave a satisfied nod and with a conspiratorial grin pressed his fingertip lightly against Luna's cheek. "Just as I thought, my clever little Luna." He lifted his goblet and took a measured sip. Hermione, seated beside them, curled her lips into a half-smile that was equal parts amusement and mild disapproval. Her ears twitched, an unconscious tell, but she turned her head away, pretending not to care. Despite her usual icy grace, Luna's pale mouth quirked up at one corner in the faintest smile, and a delicate blush bloomed across her translucent cheeks. Ryan paused for a beat, clearly enjoying the moment, then continued in a tone of proud confidence. "It's only natural they can't see through my magic. Concealment is my specialty." He leaned back, setting his goblet down with a gentle clink. "My invisibility enchantments are passive. They strengthen over time, aided by my natural aptitude. I wouldn't be surprised if no wizard, ancient or modern, could pierce them." He turned toward Luna and offered her an approving nod. "But you, Luna, your wizard's intuition, your so-called third eye, is genuinely extraordinary." Earlier this summer, Tom Riddle underwent a powerful ritual that stripped away his so-called original sin, transforming him into a humanoid unicorn. Yet even in that horned form, he remains a wizard of unparalleled potency. His magic far exceeds that of any ordinary unicorn, and no high-level unicorn sorcerer can hope to target him easily. Albus Dumbledore, for his part, had long since adapted to life without Gellert Grindelwald after their bitter parting. But when Grindelwald briefly reappeared, Dumbledore discovered how unaccustomed he was to having his old friend back, even for a short while. Chapter 111. Peeves, another win for him. Hermione exclaimed, swiveling her head toward Ryan. She pushed aside her momentary pang of jealousy. If she'd heard correctly, Dumbledore had taken over Grindelwald once again. Grindelwald, over 100 years old. How could his body even handle that? Who was really in charge here? Hermione's curiosity shone in her eyes as she silently pleaded for Ryan to spill the details. Even Luna, sitting nearby, pricked up her ears. Ryan cleared his throat. "Actually, it's nothing like that. It isn't a physical possession." "Oh," Hermione's face fell in an instant. Her little nose wrinkled, and she pouted so adorably you'd almost think she had rat teeth. On the other side of the platform, Harry, Ron, and the others climbed into their carriage, steered by a faint, musty aroma of damp wood and straw. It wasn't that the carriage was neglected. Rainy weather in Britain made that smell inevitable. Wizards were so accustomed to it, they never bothered with a universal charm to freshen the air. If anything, some of the purists argued that the mustiness was part of what made a British train journey authentically British. Ron inhaled deeply. You know what? I kind of like it. Hermione let out a breath, still disappointed about her Dumbledore Grindelwald question, while Harry settled into the corner, ready for whatever mischief, or escaped poltergeist, Peeves might spring on them next. The air is so fresh after the rain, Ron breathed, pressing his face to the carriage window. The damp scent of rotting leaves and soft earth rose from the ground, but even that couldn't spoil his praise. Only a true Brit could find this delightful. Despite his sigh, Ron's free hand gripped Lavender's tightly, as if afraid she might slip away. Lavender, cheeks warm with happiness, welcomed the gesture. She'd never seen him so clingy before. In fact, she felt a sudden urge to write a letter to Victor Krum, to thank him. If it weren't for Krum's intervention, Ron would likely still be giving her the cold shoulder. Now, though, color had returned to Ron's cheeks, and there was a new spark in his eyes. He stared out at Hogwarts, its towers rising against the storm-cleared sky, and muttered under his breath, "Just you wait, Victor Krum." He had entirely forgotten about Fleur. In that instant, all his feelings of inferiority and betrayal fused into a fierce determination. He imagined channeling every prank Fred and George had ever pulled into one colossal spell, and then delivering it straight at Krum's defender pride. That, he decided, would show everyone just how formidable Ronald Weasley could be. "Be careful, Runel," Lavender murmured, brushing her fingers across Ron's freckled cheek. Her eyes brimmed with worry. "That Durmstrang student's dangerous. They're rumored to teach dark arts, and he's a global Quidditch superstar. If you cross him, his fans will, well, you know, don't pick a fight you can't win." Ron's cheeks flared. "So you think I can't beat Krum?" He shot back, voice sharp. He turned to Harry. "His fan base is as big as yours? I'm Harry's friend too, and this is the championship. Nobody's going to look down on me just because he's from another school." "Enough!" Ginny snapped, exasperated, waving at the window as rain began to spatter against the panes. "Sit down before you flood the whole room." She paused, meeting Ron's gaze. "And leave Harry out of it. Krum's just a Quidditch player. With your magic, how is he any challenge to you?" Only 3 witches and wizards had ever ventured to the moon and mastered the magic best suited to them: herself, Harry, and Ron. In Ginny's mind, even Ron was invincible. On a magical level, Krum didn't register. Harry and Neville, she noted, hadn't protested either. Even Lavender, at the center of the whole debacle, thought Krum was a real jerk. None of them dared voice that opinion, though. They kept silent, waiting for their rendezvous with him in the Great Hall. The carriage rolled beneath imposing gates, guarded by winged boar sculptures, its wheels crunching over the wide gravel drive. Each gust of wind sent it swaying, rattling Harry's teeth against the glass as he pressed his forehead to the window. Through sheets of rain, he could just make out Hogwarts drawing closer. Dozens of warm, glowing windows set into dark stone turrets. At last, the carriage ground to a stop at the foot of a broad flight of stone steps leading to twin oak doors. In that instant, a jagged bolt of lightning split the sky. The passengers in the coach ahead tumbled out, scrambling up the slick steps and vanishing into the castle. Harry, Ron, Lavender, and Neville followed suit, bounding up 2 steps at a time. Only when they stood inside the cavernous entrance hall did they pause to look around. Torches flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows over the polished marble staircase that arched upward like a waterfall of stone. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old magic. "Blimey, it's actually waterproof," Ron exclaimed, running a hand along the archway as if testing its solidity. He glanced at Lavender, then flicked his wand. The raindrops clinging to her hair coalesced into silvery beads before vanishing in a thin wisp of steam. "Wish I'd thought to do that ages ago," he muttered sheepishly. Ron's hand tightened on his wand, but before he could act, a bright red water balloon plummeted from the ceiling and exploded right over his head. He stood there dripping and sputtering, while lavender robes stuck to his chest. Still, he managed to block Lavender when the splash hit her. He raised his eyes and barked, "Who did that?" About 20 feet above them hovered Peeves, the ever-gleeful Hogwarts poltergeist. He sported a jingling jester's cap, an orange bow tie, and of course, another water balloon ready in his hand. His bulbous cheeks flushed with outrage. "Harry Potter!" he screamed. "It's you again!" Before anyone could react, Peeves let out a shrill laugh, bounded up the marble staircase, and vanished from sight. Neville let out a relieved sigh. "You gave me a fright," he muttered, flicking his wand. With a swish, the last of the water evaporated from Ron's robes, sending up little wisps of steam. Lavender, safe and sound, leaned into Ron's side, eyes sparkling with gratitude, and perhaps a little admiration for his quick reflexes. "Peeves! Peeves, where are you?" The shrill voice echoed through the entrance hall. Professor Minerva McGonagall, deputy headmistress of Hogwarts and head of Gryffindor House, stormed through the great doors, her emerald robes swaying and her pointed hat slightly askew. She adjusted her square-framed glasses and surveyed the scene before her. Water stained the flagstones in muddy patches, but she paid it no mind, blaming the steady drizzle still falling outside. Her stern green eyes swept across the crowd of dripping students, growing ever more impatient until they landed on Harry Potter standing at the back. Relief flushed her face. "Harry, thank goodness you're here," she said in a tone that mixed exasperation and gratitude. "If you hadn't reached the entrance hall so quickly, I'd still be dragging wet wretches out of the corridors." She turned on the drenched students. "Now, if you're all quite finished getting soaked, I suggest you head inside at once and dry off." Ron Weasley, water dripping from his robes, muttered under his breath. "Fine. I'll see how fine I am once I've wrung out every stitch of this filth." He shot a glare at Victor Krum, who stood awkwardly off to one side. "This is all your fault, Krum." Ignoring the bickering pair, Harry led Lavender Brown and Neville Longbottom toward the twin side doors that led to the Great Hall. They slipped through the first door, then the second, only for Ron to come to an abrupt halt just beyond it. He tapped a foot, his face drawn tight. "Harry," he hissed, nodding over his shoulder, "you need to see this." And with that, the four friends paused, wet robes clinging to them, senses on high alert for whatever awaited just beyond the next threshold. Chapter 555, Ron Becomes Famous Again. Every eye in the Great Hall swung to the entrance the moment the doors swung open. Even Percy, so accustomed to strutting about on the strength of his ministry connections, lowered his proud chin and slunk out of the spotlight. Beside him, Fred and George Weasley could hardly contain themselves. They leapt and whooped in excitement. Atop the podium, Albus Dumbledore's eyes sparkled as though he recognized a long-lost memory. And in the small antechamber where Professor McGonagall was guiding the first years, the stern head of Gryffindor, Professor paused mid-sentence, speechless. All because of one person. Hogwarts' favorite adventurer, Ron Weasley, one of the famed Three Musketeers, had just arrived. Bursting through the opposite door, Ron's face was set in a fierce scowl. "Krum, where are you?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the enchanted ceiling. In his left arm, Lavender Brown clung to him, but even that familiar weight did nothing to soften his expression. Whispers swept the room. Did Ron Weasley truly have a crush on Victor Krum? After all, they'd been spotted together in Diagon Alley only a week before, lingering at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor for an entire afternoon, an encounter that had made the front page of every Wizarding Gazette. Then there were Ron's earlier escapades, the time he'd almost been flattened by a Hungarian horntail alongside Harry and Neville, or the countless other scrapes that had earned him both admiration and exasperation in equal measure. And now here he was again, lavender on his arm, scanning the hall for the famous Bulgarian seeker, proof, some said, that Ron's heart was even more complicated than anyone had guessed. The Great Hall held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. It's hard not to suspect that Lavender Brown was merely playing decoy for Ron. None of us spotted him leaving the Hogwarts Express. He simply vanished into the crowd, until Lavender finally broke away, determined to find him. When she did, the entire platform went buzzing. There he was, Ron Weasley, slumped against the carriage door, utterly drained, cheeks pale, eyes distant. Over and over he whispered the same name, Victor Crumb, his voice little more than a breath. Lavender rushed to his side, her cheeks flushed with worry, and tried to soothe him. But her words drifted off like steam above the rails. She looked as if she were calming a wounded hippogriff rather than her best friend. Ron's grip only tightened on his knees, his eyes fixed on empty air. That was all the incentive we needed. We, the ever-watchful witches with a penchant for mischief, pressed closer, hearts racing. This was high drama of the finest sort. The long-dormant Ron Crumb ship was about to set sail again. We couldn't help but recall those lazy days 2 years ago in Madame Pomfrey's infirmary, debating which of his schoolmates Ron secretly adored, Harry, Neville, even Draco. Some of us teased that Draco and Harry were a thing themselves, though eventually everyone drifted back to straight pairings. Among the Golden Trio, only Neville remained unattached. Harry and Draco were both engaged, and Ron, of course, was dating Lavender. But now Victor Crumb was back on British soil, and with his return came a heady rush of possibility. We all glanced toward Professor Dumbledore, beard impeccably white, robes sweeping, our minds whirring. When will the delegations from the other 3 wizarding schools arrive? How soon until Durmstrang's carriage pulls up? Because, frankly, none of us can wait to see what sparks might fly between Ron and Victor this year. Ron slumped on the doorstep, staring numbly at the cold stone floor. Professor McGonagall, who had marched over to give him a stern talking to, paused when she saw the hollow defeat in his eyes. With a disappointed sigh, she abandoned her reproach and returned to the first-year common room. Harry glanced over, concern etched on his face, and moved to sit beside Ron. Ginny, however, seized Harry's arm and pulled him away before he could say a word. Left standing alone, Neville watched the pair vanish down the corridor. Then, catching sight of a familiar, beautiful figure trailing behind Dudley a few yards away, he quietly slipped off to follow them. In moments, only Ron remained. He sat slumped against the doorframe, his face drained of color. The excitement and hope he'd felt earlier had evaporated with the news of Crumb's absence. Around him, students who knew him dared not linger, caught in the glare of infatuated girls. They didn't want to be drafted into any matchmaking rumors. Each offered a polite nod and hurried away. At last, Anthony Goldstein, class leader in this timeline and now Ron's roommate, strode up with an easy grin. Well, looks like you're famous again," he said, leaning casually against the wall. "This term, I doubt my own reputation can hold a candle to yours." He spoke as if oblivious to Ron's misery, but the slight gleam in his eye revealed he understood exactly how much Ron was hurting. Michael and Terry, standing on either side of him, couldn't resist tugging at his robe sleeves. They looked convinced he was about to do something rash. Ron, however, took a deep breath and lifted his chin. "Am I really famous now?" "Absolutely," Anthony said with a broad grin. "Your mist bottles are going to fly off the shelves." "Why didn't I think of that?" Ron muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Suddenly animated, he rose to his feet, still holding Lavender's hand, and took in the Great Hall's expectant faces. The stares that would normally have made him uneasy felt almost sweet. He offered a casual wave. A chorus of playful boos, mostly from the witches across the room, answered him like petals scattering on a breeze, a teasing sort of applause. Ron pretended not to notice, striding forward, as though he were a triumphant king returning from battle, his head high and pride swelling in his chest. Beside Anthony, Michael and Terry watched with admiration shining in their eyes. Anthony just shook his head. He wasn't fooled by Ron's newfound swagger. From the far side of the hall, Ryan looked down at the tablecloth, trying to avoid Kate's mischievous grin, but even he couldn't help a small, exasperated sigh. Of course, Anthony was prefect of Ravenclaw in the original timeline. He knew exactly what he was doing. By the time Ryan collected himself, Ron had already reached the Ravenclaw table. Lavender squeezed Ron's hand one last time, gave him an encouraging smile, and slipped off toward the Gryffindor benches, leaving Ron to bask in his moment under a shower of amused and admiring gazes. Harry tugged on Ron's sleeve the moment they sat down. "Ron, look, 6 empty seats at the staff table and 3 long benches set up beside the Slytherin table." Ron blinked at Harry as if only now noticing. "Really? I must have been daydreaming." I spotted it ages ago, Harry admitted, but leaned in. Don't go back to sleep. There's something odd going on. Ginny rolled her eyes from across the table. Never mind, Ron. What we really need to figure out is why every single ghost has disappeared. Seamus Johnson, chewing on a piece of toast, chimed in. I heard they're not gone so much as upgraded. Supposedly they look just like living people now, same size, same features, only they're transparent. Word is they're planning to show up together with ghosts from the other schools in some grand display of Ravenclaw magic. A joint appearance? Ron's fork paused midair. With the ghosts from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang? Dean leaned forward. Exactly. The other schools arrived ages ago. They're just waiting until after the sorting ceremony to make their entrance. Ghosts and all. Harry frowned, pushing his plate aside. I've gone through the archives. There's no record of any enchantment that could do this. No mention in centuries of magical folklore. If Ravenclaw really invented something that alters a ghost's form, it would have been noted. Around them, the chatter in the Great Hall swelled as the professors stepped up to the staff table. Harry, Ron, and their friends exchanged uneasy glances. The Halloween feast was about to begin, and already Hogwarts felt more mysterious than ever. Right after breakfast, the Great Hall buzzed with whispered theories. In past tournaments, the visiting schools never showed up until 3 or 4 days into term, one Gryffindor muttered. And if our resident ghosts were going to make their grand entrance, why isn't there a long, translucent table floating above us as usual? Dean Thomas chuckled. Mr. Diggle told me this year is different. Before, the tournament was announced at the start of term, and the ghosts would unveil their table right away. This time, though, the notice went out at last year's end-of-year feast, so the ghosts actually asked Professor Dumbledore to perform the enchantment live, right here in front of everyone. You remember Daedalus Diggle? Dean added, grinning. Hero of the original Order of the Phoenix, and, fun fact, he's my uncle. At once, excited chatter spread through the hall. Thanks to a recent expose in the Daily Prophet, most witches and wizards could now name every founding member of the order and recount their heroic deeds. Rumor even had it that Tophanes, Britain's premier wizarding fashion house, planned to sign several of them as spokespeople. Harry and Ginny exchanged pleased glances. Ron, however, could only focus on one thing. He leaned forward, eyes wide. So, the ghosts are really going to show up. Coming up next, right after the sorting ceremony, that little scamp Piglet Flobberworm finally makes his debut. Special thanks to Sleeping Conch for the monthly ticket, and heartfelt thanks to everyone who's recommended and subscribed. Your support keeps the story alive. Chapter 113, The Troublemaking Branch Song. Time crawled by at a torturous pace. Ryan had never felt anything like it. Ever since Kate and Penello, who was supposed to be busy with his duties as student council president, joined the throng of onlookers, they'd all been staring openly at his every exchange with Luna and Hermione. He felt as if he were perched on a bed of needles. Even tuning in to his favorite 8 diagrams, radio show couldn't distract him from the mounting tension. All around him, the conversation revolved around a single topic, the Final Four. Rumors zipped through Hogwarts' corridors like rogue bludgers. Who would represent the school? What trials would the tournament include? And how did Beauxbatons, Durmstrang, and Castello Bruxo compare to Hogwarts? Good grief, this was summer break, and he was a Muggle-born. How could these magically raised students be so clueless about other wizarding schools? What was there to discuss? And more importantly, hadn't Ron already made a monumental fool of himself? Why wasn't everyone talking about that instead? Ryan felt as though he'd been trapped in a cocoon ever since the semifinals match, and the only way out was to shatter the glass jar. Without a second thought, he broke it, then took Hermione's and Luna's small hands and led them through the precise gestures of Wagado magic. Harry, by contrast, would normally be scrutinizing the staff table, especially Dumbledore's every move. But after Dean's warning, he couldn't bring himself to look that way. Instead, he prowled the corridors, searching for signs of the other schools. All he discovered was a Hogwarts transformed by an obsessive cleaning spell. Even the most neglected portraits had been scrubbed spotless, their subjects now huddled in their frames, muttering complaints and wincing at the newly revealed pink skin beneath their ripped canvases. Suits of armor gleamed where they once creaked, and above them the enchanted ceiling mirrored the stormiest sky Harry had ever seen, swirling black and purple clouds roiling overhead, punctuated by jagged bolts of lightning that flashed in time with each thunderous clap. Professor McGonagall stepped forward without warning, and the little first-year's boats nosed gently onto the shore. The steady rain had left every new student soaked to the bone. Robes clung plastered to backs, hair dripped in front of anxious faces, but no one had dared complain. Lined up on the lawn, backs to the staff table, they awaited the next stage of their lives at Hogwarts, just as generations before them had done. Yet this year's novices looked more nervous than usual. The relentless drizzle had shaken their confidence. Every pair of eyes darted from professor to professor, from the grand castle behind them to the turbulent lake at their feet. Everyone, that is, except one boy. He had sleek, buttery blonde hair and held himself with a brash, almost defiant poise. While the others shifted nervously, he stood perfectly still, chin tilted slightly upward, shoulders squared. It was an arrogance Harry had never seen in a first year before. Curious, Harry glanced at Ron, who was standing not far away. Ron, too, had noticed the newcomer. He lifted his head and shot the blonde boy a dark, wary look, one that told Harry the boy had already made an enemy. Harry felt a flicker of pity. This proud child was in for a rough welcome. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat and moved to the center of the lawn. With a graceful nod, she set down a small, three-legged stool. Atop it rested the sorting hat, so old and tattered that patches of faded fabric and fraying seams had turned it into a motley quilt of wizarding history. The first years stared at it in wide-eyed silence, the air thick with anticipation. At last, their destiny was about to be revealed. For a moment, the great hall fell silent. Then, with a sudden crack along its rim, the sorting hat sprang to life and began to sing. 1,000 years have come and gone since Hogwarts first arose in song. 4 mighty founders laid its stones, and wizards came from lands unknown. First Irva's, Hufflepuff's own friend, was granted means the school addressed to Lendidmaith, a hidden place away from sight. Thus Castrubsha found its quiet light. Then wise Maxim of Ravenclaw returned to France to teach the law of mind and magic, clear and bright, and so was born Beauxbaton's light. Bold Volcanova next took wing from Gryffindor's Red Lion's Ring to Germany, where witches' fame lay low. Durmstrang was born in their name. Last came Monte, proud Slytherin, who crossed the sea to lead within. He gave Durmstrang its dueling lore, a school of war magic evermore. When the hat fell silent, the hall erupted into warm applause. Lisa Dupin leaned toward Harry, an intrigued smile on her face. So those 3 schools actually trace their roots back to Hogwarts? She exhaled softly, then met Harry's steady gaze. In their generation, few carried as much authority, or as many answers, as he did. Harry's voice trembled as he spoke. This year's school song is nothing short of a provocation. It's practically a call to arms. Padma looked around in alarm. "What do you mean?" murmured everyone nearby, leaning in to catch his words. Harry ran a hand through his hair. Every wizarding school uses wards that fool muggles into seeing nothing but empty ruins. Hogwarts does it, of course, and so does Castrubsha. But here's the odd part. No one can agree whose idea it was first. Then there's Beauxbaton's. Its founder, Maxim, never returned home, not out of selfless wisdom, but because Beauxbaton's council exiled her. Why? He let the question hang. Because, well, you know, she's French. And Durmstrang's founder, Volcanova, died under mysterious circumstances while still headmistress. She was succeeded by Halfon Mont, a former Slytherin. He seized power so swiftly it seemed almost hereditary. Funny, given that the new song keeps harping on inheritance. Mont was the one who ushered in the first dark period at Durmstrang. Harry's eyes were haunted as he finished. So when they sing about legacy and vengeance, they're not just being poetic, it's an outright dare. Lisa Dupin swallowed hard. Then they won't dare attack us directly, she whispered hopefully. Ron snorted. Attack? Brilliant. Let them try. I've been dying to duel Krum in the open. Lisa gaped at him. What? You can't stand him? Padma frowned. Lisa, you haven't heard? As the students exchanged grim looks, it was clear this year's song had stirred more than just school spirit. It had stoked the embers of a brewing conflict, one they couldn't afford to ignore. Padma Patil's twin sister, Parvati, was Lavender Brown's closest friend, and the two of them had been in the Hogwarts Express carriage when Lavender had been griping about Victor Krum. "I like him?" Ron exploded, slamming his hand on the table. "I only had a little crush, once, but that's over. Padma, you heard me. Krum actually confessed to Lavender, my girlfriend." Padma gave a small nod, but her eyes told a different story. Ron's anger wasn't just about Krum's confession. It was jealousy. Krum, who didn't seem the type to be interested in men, had the nerve to fall for Lavender, and Ron resented it. Harry, however, barely registered the drama. He'd already decided the school song was nothing but a taunt, and spent the whole time craning his neck toward the dice. All he really wanted to know was who the boy with the shock of yellow hair would be, if he was the same one Ron had such a beef with. Ron leaned in to fill Harry in on every last detail, but Harry's attention was fixed on the sorting ceremony. The Chancellor's voice called out several names, then suddenly, "Zacharias Smith! Hufflepuff!" As the last first year made his way to the Hufflepuff table, the sorting hat and stool were whisked away by Professor McGonagall. Harry let out a low groan and muttered, "Damn, another Smith." "Sure, please go ahead and paste the full chapter you'd like rewritten, and I'll transform it into a polished, idiomatic English version." Chapter 114, Beauxbatons. What did the students of Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin really think of Hufflepuff? To them, Hufflepuffs were selfless, fair, and loyal, sometimes almost to a fault. Many found their steadfastness a bit tiresome. They never questioned rumors and always followed the crowd. Harry was musing over his own quick judgments when a blonde Hufflepuff freshman named Zacharias strode forward and, without hesitation, took a first-year's empty seat. Before Harry could intervene, Dudley Dursley, now a reformed Hufflepuff himself, shoved through the crowd, ready to teach him a lesson. "Harry, what's wrong?" Ginny asked, her voice low and worried as she gripped his hand. She hadn't heard his thoughts but sensed his unease. Harry shook his head. "Tell me, Ginny, have you ever seen a Hufflepuff pick on someone else on their own initiative?" Ginny frowned. "That's not really. Well, Dudley did, but only before he came to Hogwarts." Harry laughed softly. "No, Dudley's proud to be in Hufflepuff now. He only joined after he straightened up." Ginny glanced toward the Hufflepuff table, where a yellow-haired boy was glaring at Zacharias. "You're talking about him?" Harry nodded. "Yeah, that one." Ginny followed Harry's gaze and saw Dudley lecturing a younger student, and despite what Harry had insisted, Dudley himself didn't look like a bully. "That's him," Harry muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "How did someone like that get sorted into Hufflepuff? He's exactly the sort you'd distrust at first sight. When they assigned him there, I was sure it was a mistake." He turned away, determined not to look. Ginny cocked her head. "Why are you so bent out of shape over a first year?" Harry sighed. "His last name's Smith. Now I finally get why Ryan hates him." "Smith?" Ginny frowned. "That's a common name. But yellow hair and Smith— oh wait, there's only one. Why didn't I connect the dots sooner? Now I see why Hufflepuff took him." "Why?" Harry pressed. "Because the true descendants of Helga Hufflepuff have always been called Smith," Ginny explained. "But they're nothing like the humble, fair-minded founder. Legend says that after Hufflepuff died, these ancestors stole her precious gold cup from the Hogwarts kitchens. Instead of living up to her values, they've carried themselves with pure Slytherin arrogance ever since. Honestly, they're more like Slytherins than Hufflepuffs." Harry's eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. Ron, who had stepped aside, was poised to call out "time" once the sorting hat ceremony ended, just as he always did in past years. But tonight, he didn't reach for his knife and fork, nor did he stare at the gleaming golden plate before him. Instead, his full attention was fixed on Professor Dumbledore, who had suddenly risen from his seat. With a graceful flick of his wand, Dumbledore summoned a patch of dark sky above the Great Hall. From it came the distant rumble of wind and rain, even the tang of fresh water in the air. Whispers spread through the students like wildfire. "What's that?" a first-year Gryffindor called out. "The Forbidden Forest," someone answered. "Something's flying." "A dragon? No, a house." "Which school is it from?" Eyes turned upward as the mysterious shape streaked across the inky firmament, a vast silhouette, far larger than any broomstick, or even 100 broomsticks bound together. It hurtled toward the castle, growing larger by the second. Only when it cleared the treetops of the forbidden forest and passed into the light of the castle's windows did its true form emerge. A colossal powder-blue carriage, the size of a small manor, borne aloft by 12 magnificent winged horses. All the horses had silver manes, and each one was as massive as an elephant. Suddenly, a thunderous clatter echoed through the room, from the enchanted screen and beyond the door. On the screen, the view shifted to the corridor outside. Mighty hoofbeats pounded the stone floor, each strike sounding like a dinner plate smashing to the ground. Then, the shudder that ran through its enormous wheels, the golden carriage touched down. The horses tossed their huge heads, their ruby-red eyes flashing. "It's Beauxbatons," Ron said softly, exhaling. Yet a small grin tugged at his lips. He was thinking of Fleur, whom he'd met in Flourish and Blots. Harry chuckled dryly. "You spotted the crest, huh?" 2 golden wands crossed like a saltire, with 3 stars bursting from each tip. The memory of that mysterious French witch made him feel oddly self-conscious standing next to Ginny. The carriage had stood still until now. No doubt the rain kept its doors shut. But at last, the door swung open, and a boy in a sky-blue robe leapt out. A ripple of magic swept through the carriage as he stepped inside. Raindrops glided around him, never daring to touch his cloak. He knelt, searching the carriage floor by feel, and at his fingertips a gilded ladder shimmered into being. It unfurled itself smoothly, extending down into the hallway below. From the ladder's polished handrail, a deep blue canopy blossomed overhead, and before anyone could blink, a single glossy black high-heeled shoe, nearly the size of a child's sled, anchored the ladder firmly in place. A collective gasp went up from the assembled students and teachers. Foot poised on the ladder's lowest rung, the carriage door swung open, and out stepped the mysterious witch. Harry and his friends exchanged eager glances. They'd known this visitor had to be the giantess Hagrid spoke so fondly of, the half-blood witch who shared her surname with the founder of Beauxbatons and now presided as the school's headmistress. Yet even so, they hadn't expected her to look like this. Candlelight in the corridor fell upon a face of striking handsomeness rather than the bulky, fleshy visage some had imagined. Olive-toned skin seemed to glow from within. High cheekbones gave her an aristocratic air, and dark, almond-shaped eyes, bright with wit and warmth, surveyed them all. Each graceful step she took announced her authority, and Harry felt a thrill of excitement ripple through the crowd at her very presence. Madame Maxime might have been half giant, but at first glance she could have passed for an exquisite French noblewoman. Her large, dark, liquid eyes and finely pointed nose framed a face of cool elegance. Her coal-black brocade gown was cut to flatter every curve, and her hair was swept into a sleek, shining bun. Around her throat and on her broad, graceful fingers sparkled opals so lavish they took Harry's breath away. He and his friends exchanged puzzled looks. This did not fit their idea of a half-giant. Ron, craning his neck, tried to see who trailed behind her. Only now did he make out a dozen or so Beauxbatons students, boys and girls in silk robes without cloaks, shivering in the cold. Harry followed Ron's gaze, but spotted no one wearing the dramatic headscarf or scarf he'd expected the French witch to hide behind. Perhaps she blended in among them, he thought. By then, the students had fallen into 2 neat columns behind Madame Maxime and filed toward the tables. They claimed seats at the long table nearest Slytherin's, the one tucked into the corner of the great hall's 3 grand feasting tables, where they stood for a moment, chattering softly, their robes gleaming in the candlelight. The headmistress made her way up to the staff table on the stage. She greeted Dumbledore with a warm smile, then settled into the chair beside Hagrid. Chapter 115, Durmstrang. Chapter 558, Durmstrang. Why wasn't she introduced? Lisa Dupin asked, tilting her head in genuine puzzlement as she stared at the tall witch standing before them. That's Olympe Maxime, Padma Patil replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. She's the headmistress of Beauxbatons, and a direct descendant of its founder. It's summer break. How have you not heard of her, Lisa? I know who she is, Lisa snapped, crossing her arms. My point is, they never bothered to announce her formally. Dean, who'd been watching the scene unfold, cleared his throat. Actually, professors from the other 2 schools have come to Hogwarts this summer. Only Beauxbatons sent their headmistress, Ms. Maxime, Padma cut in. The delegates from Durmstrang and Castello Bruxo haven't arrived yet. Look." All eyes swiveled to the enchanted image hovering in midair. The projection shifted, revealing the surface of the Black Lake at dusk, calm, dark, and deceptively still. Then, without warning, the water began to churn. A roaring commotion rose from the lake's center as monstrous plumes of water shot skyward, crashing against the shore in tumbling waves. At the very heart of the disturbance, a giant whirlpool yawned open, as though some colossal plug had been pulled from the lake bed. From that maelstrom emerged a long, ebony mast, dark and stately, followed by the sweeping lines of rigging, an uncanny silhouette of a ship rising from the depths. The students exchanged astonished glances. Whatever was appearing before them, it promised that this summer's visit would be far more extraordinary and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "This must be Durmstrang," Ron sneered, drawing his wand and methodically wiping it on the hem of his robe. Seamus frowned. "How do you know? Need I say?" Ron shot back. "Durmstrang is up in the frozen north. There's no way they'd sail a ship through a rainforest. Crumb, crumb." His voice dropped to a whisper as he licked his lips, eyes glittering almost madly. A chill ran through everyone nearby. They raised their heads just in time to see the spectral ship fully emerge from the misty waters, its timbers glowing with a pale, otherworldly light. Rain lashed its decks as it glided toward the shore, waves splashing over its bow. With a thunderous clank, the anchor hit the shallow water. Moments later, a timber gangplank thudded onto the rocks. A lone figure stepped onto the dock. Harry's breath caught. This was the second man he'd seen who, at a single glance, proclaimed himself a wizard. Golden hair spilled over ornate black leather robes, inlaid with mysterious metal filigree. His slender fingers curled around a dark, polished cane, and he stood unmoved by the rain or the wind. There was no doubt who he was. Gellert Grindelwald. Harry found himself glancing at Dumbledore out of the corner of his eye. Around him, the other professors were exchanging sly, excited looks, each one secretly watching the headmaster himself. Even Dumbledore seemed aware of the attention, his twinkling eyes sweeping the room as if inviting them to stare. Then, without warning, the floating screen above them went black. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, and when the image reappeared, it was from behind a group of figures arrayed in the driving rain. Thick, black fur cloaks shrouded them all, each as broad and bulky as Crabbe or Goyle. The camera lingered on their backs, the fur heavy and matted by the downpour. But the central figure was different. His cloak's fur was the same silver-white as his hair, flowing smoothly down his shoulders like a living mantle. Even in the cold, wet rain, it remained sleek and untangled, the fabric so fine that it seemed to glow against the dim evening sky. Despite the cloak's grandeur, the man himself walked with unmistakable humility. His head was bowed, his posture almost reverent as he made his way toward the castle's looming entrance. Harry barely had time to take in the sight when Ginny's whisper crackled in his ear, warm against his skin. "That's Karkaroff," she warned. "The former Death Eater father and the other Aurors told us to watch out for him, and he's still serving as headmaster." Ginny stared at the photograph Mrs. Weasley had pressed into her hand. It showed Igor Karkaroff a few years earlier, standing before the Italian Ministry of Magic during his time as Durmstrang's headmaster. In that picture, he looked every inch the proud, confident ruler, his chin high, his robes immaculate, an air of command clinging to him. But here in the flesh, he seemed subdued, even servile. Ginny exchanged a puzzled look with Harry. "Why does he strike me more like a servant than a headmaster?" she murmured. Harry leaned in, his voice low. "Think about it. Grindelwald's taken him under his wing. When your former boss becomes your new master, you don't risk acting too big for your boots." Ginny barely registered Ron's darkening expression as he turned to face them. His cheeks flared scarlet. "Honestly," he huffed, "I'm in no mood for your secret meetings. Can we put this on hold? I've got a bone to pick with Crumb first." "We weren't plotting anything," Harry replied, amused. "Whatever you say," Ron grumbled, crossing his arms. At that moment, the great auditorium doors swung open. A hush fell over the assembled students and staff as Gellert Grindelwald strode in, tall, pale, and utterly self-assured. His white-blonde hair caught the torchlight, and his piercing eyes scanned the hall like a king surveying his court. Beside him walked Karkaroff, shoulders hunched and gaze lowered, a stark contrast to the confident figure in the old photograph. Behind them came the guest delegations. First, the Beauxbaton students, led by Fleur Delacour, her silvery hair and refined poise making her instantly recognizable. Then Durmstrang's contingent, mostly silent, some casting nervous glances at Karkaroff. At the very end of the line, almost swallowed by sweeping robes, walked Victor Krum. Even as an international Quidditch star, Krum lingered at the back, aloof and almost anonymous among his peers. Today, the crowd greeted him with polite curiosity rather than cheers, a reminder that fame abroad doesn't always translate into popularity at school. Every eye in the hall now fixed on Grindelwald as he ascended the dais. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. This gathering would set the tone for their new, unsettling alliance. The moment Victor Krum stepped into the Great Hall, a hush fell across the students. Whispers died on their lips, and even those who'd been itching to shout his name bit back their words, eyeing him as though he were a walking contagion. Krum, however, seemed unperturbed. With the ease of someone accustomed to this mix of awe and trepidation, he scanned the long tables and caught sight of his friends. He lifted a hand in greeting toward the Ravenclaw table, where Ron, Harry, Neville, and their companions sat. Ron opened his mouth to reply, then thought better of it and merely offered a tight, uncertain smile. Next, Krum turned toward the Gryffindors and teasingly blew Lavender Brown a kiss. Lavender waved back, cheeks flushed. Finally, Victor slipped over to sit at the Slytherin table, an arrangement that left Ron scowling in his chair. Krum settled onto a bench beside the house's upperclassmen, his confident facade giving way for an instant to a shy, relieved grin. At least this time, he'd managed to diffuse any awkwardness. Ron had greeted him politely and refrained from making a scene. Meanwhile, across the hall, Antonin Dolohov, no, Drago Malfoy, no, wait, it was Igor Karkaroff, stood hesitating at the signal of the man beside him. Gellert Grindelwald, seated at the staff table next to Dumbledore, had lifted an eyebrow in instruction. But Karkaroff shook his head, stepped away from the professor's dais, and slunk back to the Durmstrang table, looking every bit as downtrodden as his posture suggested. Grindelwald, by contrast, settled himself with an easy arrogance. He leaned forward on the polished wood as if the rest of the world didn't exist, and regarded Albus Dumbledore with that cool, unreadable gaze of his. Dumbledore, for his part, suppressed a slight stiffness around the collar, but the old headmaster did not avert his eyes. A silent contest was already underway. One more tremor in the uneasy peace that bound Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang together this fateful year. Ron, maybe it's just a misunderstanding, Harry said after a moment's thought. Even if Krum can be a bit graceless, he wouldn't blow a kiss at your girlfriend right in front of us. Remember, us includes you. Is it possible he simply doesn't know you two are together? Ron shook his head emphatically. No way. Absolutely not. True, I never told him Lavender's my girlfriend, but he's been pen pals with her forever. He even said he knew both of us. How could he not know we're a couple? Padma, standing nearby, looked uncomfortable. But my sister told me otherwise. She introduced Krum to Lavender and said Lavender was single. Ron waved her off. Parvati said that, but she also called him a brute. There's only one possibility. He's deliberately courting Lavender, fully aware I'm her boyfriend. Harry and Neville exchanged glances. They both knew they had to talk to Lavender, and fast, before things got any more tangled. Chapter 16. Castrabush Krum had convinced himself he'd grown immune to everything, so numb that the very ideas of life and death barely registered. Before Grindelwald's arrival, he was untouchable at the school, Karkaroff's star pupil, respected and envied by both peers and professors. Then came the Dark Wizard, and everything changed. Krum had openly opposed Grindelwald's ideology. In response, his classmates turned their backs on him, and even Karkaroff withdrew his favor. Oddly, it was Grindelwald's own intervention that stopped outright persecution. Rather than a violent purge, everyone simply ignored Krum. He told himself he'd mastered calm in the face of disaster. Until today, danger. The thought burst through Krum's mind like a curse. His heart jackhammered in his chest as he spun to locate the threat. There, standing not 5 paces away, was Ron Weasley. Ron's gaze bore into him with an intensity that bordered on frenzy. A couple of Slytherin students, collected for the customary honor guard, exchanged nervous glances. One whispered that Ron had just called out Krumm's name, certain he couldn't see him. It hit Krumm like a bludger to the head. Ron was in love with him. His stomach twisted into knots. Never before had he felt so vulnerable. But then the crowd stirred, voices rising in surprise and curiosity, shattering the tense bubble around the two of them. In that moment, Krumm clung to a single fleeting hope, that the uproar of bystanders might save him from the most terrifying danger he'd ever faced. Harry noticed Ron shift his gaze skyward, and everyone around them followed suit. In an instant, the vista above their heads blurred and reformed, and they found themselves standing on the grassy shore beside the Black Lake. A low rumble vibrated through both earth and air, and the ground beneath them surged upward. Dark soil and jagged stones heaved as though something was pushing up from below. With a sudden crack, a massive redwood trunk burst from the trembling earth. Moments later, a wooden spiral staircase unfurled from the tree's heart, twisting down until its base met the grass. A slender, wheat-colored hand emerged first, followed by the figure of a witch in a vivid green robe. Her long brown hair framed an oval face, and her narrow, phoenix-like eyes glinted with formidable authority. She was clearly someone not to be underestimated. Close behind her descended an elderly man with flowing white hair and beard. His features bore an uncanny resemblance to Dumbledore's, only darker, and he wore the same bright green robes as the students who trailed after him. From their identical robes alone, one could scarcely tell professors from pupils or even headmasters from third years. Hermione leaned toward Harry, eyes wide with curiosity. "Is he really not related to Dumbledore?" she whispered. Ryan shook his head. "No, there are plenty of unrelated people who just happen to look alike. I should have introduced him properly. This is Castor Pollock, grandfather of the famous pharmacist Libashu Pollock." Once they stepped into the Great Hall, the Castrumbush delegation split into two parties. The students made their way to the second long table, seated between Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, right beside the Slytherins. The elder and the witch joined the faculty at the staff table. He took the seat next to Professor Snape, while she settled between Professors McGonagall and Flitwick. Professor Flitwick, perched on his customary stack of cushions, gave a startled squeak and nearly tumbled off. At that moment, Dumbledore waved his wand and banished the shimmering portrait that had hovered above the head table. Clearing his throat, he addressed the room. "I know you're all brimming with questions," he began, his eyes twinkling. "And you've probably noticed this tournament is unlike any other we've held. It will not be confined to a handful of champions representing each school. This year, every one of you will take part. There are 3 challenges in total, and we will conclude by May of next year. Each challenge will unfold in 2 stages, a group phase and an individual phase. Be prepared. Each of you will have your chance to shine. The group competition is open to all students and faculty and will encompass 3 disciplines: cooperative potions, war magic, and alchemy. The heads of the other 3 schools will provide further details shortly. As for the individual contest, it will determine the tournament's champion warrior, chosen by impartial judges appointed from each of our 4 colleges. Selections will begin promptly at 6 this Friday, and I trust everyone will participate enthusiastically." Dumbledore paused, then raised his wand. With a single gentle tap, a long table laden with food rose into the air as if buoyed by unseen currents. Gasps rippled through the assembled students and professors. They all knew what was coming next. For the very first time in public, Dumbledore would demonstrate Ravenclaw's most closely guarded spell, ghostification. In an instant, every dish, platter, and goblet shimmered and transformed into ethereal fare, perfectly suited for consumption by ghosts. Even the visiting students seated near the Slytherins, who had been discreetly briefed in advance, held their breath. No one dared utter a word as they watched, rapt for what would follow. High above the Great Hall, Dumbledore poured every last ounce of his power into the air. At once, everything in the space above the tables shimmered and shifted. Chandeliers floated free of their chains, banners rippled without wind, and the enchanted ceiling pulsed with new light. Then, remarkably, Dumbledore's wand hand went still, his frame locked in an almost statue-like pose. Only the faintest quiver of his wand revealed that he was anything but at rest. Harry stared, breath caught, as the wand in Dumbledore's hand began to tremble. The slender blue veins along the old wizard's right hand stood out sharply against his pale skin, knuckles whitening as he summoned the strength to finish what he had begun. From the wand's tip unfurled a ribbon of milky white magic, curling and twisting in midair. Time seemed to stretch. The spell held itself suspended as every eye in the hall watched. Then, with a final, deliberate flourish, Dumbledore traced an arc in the air. The glowing spell letters, an elegant swirl of ancient runes, broke free and darted toward the now hovering high table. A blinding flash of white light seared the chamber, and when Harry's vision cleared, a long, transparent banquet table hovered where nothing had been moments before. Its dishes and goblets shone with the same ghostly clarity. One by one, the portraits and tapestries along the walls released their spectral occupants. The ghosts drifted forth, no longer wreathed in the pale glow of their usual hauntings. Their forms were perfectly defined, so lifelike that, but for their utter translucence, one might have sworn them flesh and blood. They paused around the table as if invited guests, awaiting the feast they could never truly taste. Dumbledore raised his wand again in a final sweeping gesture. In an instant, the rest of the hall blossomed. The floating banners found their places. The enchanted ceiling alighted with 1,000 dancing stars, and even the very air hummed with warmth and welcome. Satisfied, Dumbledore lowered his arm and offered the assembled ghosts the slightest triumphant nod. The great hall, transformed by ancient wizardry, stood ready for its most unusual dinner party yet. Huge silk banners unfurled along the walls, each bearing the crest of one of Hogwarts' 4 houses, a golden lion on scarlet for Gryffindor, a bronze eagle on azure for Ravenclaw, a black badger on gold for Hufflepuff, and a silver serpent on green for Slytherin. Dominating the space behind the high table was the grand Hogwarts coat of arms, lion, eagle, badger, and snake intertwined around a towering letter H. Albus Dumbledore rose from his seat, his eyes twinkling behind half-moon spectacles. I'd love to say we've been counting down the minutes for this feast, and simply bid you dig in, but our 3 distinguished guest headmasters have graciously agreed to introduce themselves first. At Dumbledore's side, the stern figure of Igor Karkaroff placed a gloved hand on the headmaster's shoulder before stepping forward. Good evening. I speak on behalf of Durmstrang Institute, he began, his voice cool and measured. Many believe our school's specialty lies in the dark arts. In truth, we pride ourselves on mastery of dueling and war magic. If you listen closely to our school song, you'll know exactly what I mean. I should also remind you that the first group challenge, focused entirely on war magic, will begin in October. With that, Karkaroff nodded, fell silent, and returned to his seat, leaving the hall buzzing with anticipation for the trials to come. Every Saturday at 3 o'clock, I'll be giving a lecture on war magic right here in the Great Hall. The elderly professor swept the students with a graceful bow before settling back into his seat. Harry stared in surprise as the old man, this time with hardly any attempt at discretion, placed a hand on Dumbledore's shoulder. Yet the headmaster remained perfectly still, his face calm and unreadable, as if he hadn't felt a thing. Chapter 560, The Relationship Between Team Competition and Individual Competition. A hushed anticipation settled over the great hall as a dignified silver-haired wizard stepped onto the dais. Clad in deep purple robes that swept the floor, he surveyed the crowd with calm, knowing eyes. Without a word, he took his seat behind the long oak judge's table. Instantly, a ripple of excited whispers spread through the students. Who is he? Why doesn't he introduce himself? He's so cool. Look at that posture. Just look at Karkaroff over there. He's trembling. And what exactly is this war magic? Do team events tie into the individual contests? Who's the referee anyway? I bet that's Dumbledore himself. Before the speculation could die down, the double doors at the back swung open. In stepped a strikingly tall woman whose build rivaled Hagrid's, and yet her features were chiseled and refined, with high cheekbones and an imperious carriage. The hall collectively gasped. Good afternoon, she called, her voice rich and steady. I am Headmistress Olam Maxim. Her clear introduction cut through the chatter, but only for a heartbeat. Almost immediately, the students' murmurs resumed. Maxim? As in the name from our school anthem? Then who are the actual descendants of Beauxbaton's founder? Headmistress Maxim offered a gracious smile, then settled into the empty seat beside the silent elder, confirming in that instant the long-suspected truth. Albus Dumbledore himself would be overseeing the trials to come. Ahead lay the ultimate test of war magic, where group strategy and individual skill would collide in one dramatic competition. Amid the buzz of conversation, one remark made Ryan's eyebrows shoot up. His left hand, which had been tucked under the table on Luna's thigh, slid away as he quietly snapped his fingers. Instantly, thud! Zachary Smith, Dudley's eager right-hand man in every prank and bullying session, pounded his fist on the desk and leapt to his feet. "Just you wait," he bellowed, voice echoing off the walls. "I, Zachary Smith, descendant of the great Hufflepuff line, swear that once I graduate, I'll replace that slippery old Dumbledore as the greatest headmaster Hogwarts has ever known." "Hey, what?" Before he could finish, Dudley rammed his elbow into Zachary's side, forcing him back onto his chair. "You're crushing me. Let me breathe, you ridiculous mudblood." A collective gasp rippled through the students. At the staff table, Professor McGonagall's eyes blazed with anger. Professor Flitwick literally toppled off his cushion in surprise. Even kindly Professor Sprout blushed as she hurried to steady him. And in the back, Professor Snape, normally the picture of detached misery, suddenly straightened, a flicker of interest crossing his dark features at the insult aimed at Lily's only son. Before any of the other professors could move, Severus Snape was already striding up to Zacharias Smith. In one swift motion, he seized the Hufflepuff student by the front of his robes and lifted him off his feet. The instant Zacharias left the ground, his bravado drained away. He looked as though all the air had been shoved out of him. Snape's voice was a low, cold rumble. Well, a descendant of a so-called great founder, destined for my dungeon." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he glanced around the silent auditorium. "No house points will be docked. Technically, term hasn't even begun yet, has it?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dudley, standing nearby, looked ready to pipe up again, but Snape shot him a withering glare. He forced a thin smile and added, "However, detention. Effective immediately, until Professor Sprout decides otherwise." He didn't wait for a response. He simply hauled Zacharias toward the side exit and disappeared into the shadowed corridor. A ripple of laughter and mocking cheers followed the pair as they went. Harry found himself stealing a look at Ryan, curious whether she'd be pleased by Zacharias's comeuppance. But her face was blank, unreadable. Luna was chattering away beside her, and Hermione sat with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a pout. Harry thought, Ryan clearly can't stand Zacharias, yet she won't even crack a smile. Typical Ryan. He turned his gaze back to the courtyard, determined not to draw any attention to himself. He refused to be the next Zacharias Smith. Madame Maxime sat on the faculty bench, her face the picture of calm composure. She'd never meant to cause a stir, only to share a small, this playful moment with the Hogwarts students who'd just finished singing their school song. She was certain they'd recognize the name Maxime in the lyrics and had half-jokingly planned to tease them a little. What she hadn't expected was how quickly things would spiral out of her control. If Rubus Hagrid hadn't cleared his throat beside her, she might never have brought herself to stop. She gave a soft, nervous laugh. "Well, you've guessed correctly. The Maxim you heard in your anthem is indeed my name, Maxime. But I must clarify. My ancestors did not return to France out of homesickness, nor were they at odds with the wizarding world here, as some might suggest. In truth, were ostracized and remained in England." Another emphatic cough from Hagrid cut her off. Her cheeks warmed as she caught the eager glances of her Beauxbaton students and one particularly intense stare from a girl wearing a headscarf. Realizing she'd revealed more than she intended, Madame Maxime straightened her posture, forced a gracious smile, and waved her hand in reassurance. "But let's put all that aside for now," she said lightly. "I'm sure you're wondering why we include alchemy, combat magic, and collaborative potion making in our team competitions, aren't you?" She glanced around the great hall, inviting questions as the assembled students leaned forward in anticipation. "How does this tie into the individual competition?" Professor McGonagall asked, raising an eyebrow. Madame Maxime smiled and glanced around the hall. It's straightforward. You'll be responsible for supplying alchemical ingredients and brewing group potions for our warrior teams. During the games, the competitors can draw on these potions, and when the moment calls for it, you'll employ wartime magic to support them. All of the supplies, the spells, the potions, they'll be standardized, ready-made products. And as your professor of alchemy, I'll be directing this second phase, the group competition. She offered a brief nod. Officially, our work begins in January, but I don't expect you to wait that long for instruction. Starting now, I will hold classes every Saturday from 10 to 11 in the auditorium. With that, Madame Maxime sank into her seat, as if afraid to speak another word. Hagrid, standing at her side, reached out and gently squeezed her hand. A murmur of comfort passed between them. Just then, Professor Snape swept back into the room. His usually sullen expression was gone, replaced by an almost buoyant air, as though he'd cast off a long-held burden. Instantly, the students erupted in excited chatter. The delay in the feast seemed forgotten, their hunger replaced by gossip and speculation. Alchemy? There's never been a course like that at Hogwarts. It'll be taught by Madame Maxime. And look, Professor Snape's back! Someone called out with relief and, strangely, a hint of triumph. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the Ravenclaw common room as 4 students gathered around a low, carved table, their voices bubbling over with the day's discoveries. Just look at Zacharias. He looks utterly defeated, Mia laughed, nudging her notebook aside. Alchemy props? What on earth will we make? Flying shoes, like in Doraemon. Ethan grinned. Right? All those Doraemon episodes I binge-watched are finally paying off. But seriously, did you notice the Skywalker Alchemy Workshop's display? It almost seems like all their gadgets are already complete. Clara rolled her eyes. And did you hear how Professor Vance dismissed Ravenclaws this morning? It was downright condescending. Isn't that exactly what Ravenclaw is all about? Ben chimed in. We're fiercely independent. Some might even call us eccentric. But genius rarely marches in step with the crowd. In our house, you wear what you like, believe what you want, and speak your mind. We don't just tolerate individuality, we celebrate it. Bah, Ethan scoffed. My grandmother said she was practically ostracized at Hogwarts just because her robes didn't match everyone else's. Clara waved a hand. Old stories aside, let's move on. What's next on our schedule? Mia leaned forward, eyes bright. War magic, right? Aren't you all curious what that actually involves? Ben tapped his quill on the table. And who's this mysterious old war mage who's joining us? He looks like Dumbledore's long-lost cousin. Ethan chuckled. Did you see Professor Riddle's face turn green whenever anyone mentioned him? Mia sighed dreamily. Honestly, though, I'd still pick Professor Riddle over any ancient war wizard. He's handsome, clever, and I feel safe in his class. They laughed together as the last rays of sun slipped behind the mountains, already speculating about the next day's lessons and the next grand adventure Ravenclaw would undertake. It looks like the chapter text didn't come through, only the "ha" line. Could you please paste the full machine-translated chapter you'd like me to revise? That way I can turn it into a smooth, idiomatic English version for you. Chapter 118, Heartbroken Harry. The Great Hall was alive with excited chatter, mostly students clustered around, vying for a word with their favorite potions instructor, Professor Riddle. Murmurs and squeals of admiration filled the air until at once Albus Dumbledore rose from the staff table and held up a hand. Instantly, the hall fell silent. Across from him, a dignified witch stepped forward. She swept back her silver-streaked hair, adjusted her robes, and smiled at the assembled students and teachers. Good evening, she began, her voice clear. I am Headmistress Nefinch Vokanova of Castrubshe Academy. As you may know, our school specializes in collaborative brewing, what we like to call group potions. Before I introduce our own Professor Palachi, I'd like to share that the enchantment we use to conceal our campus location is entirely our own creation, the first of its kind. A round of applause erupted from the Castrubshe delegation. At the Gryffindor table, however, Fred and George Weasley led a chorus of boos. Professor McGonagall shot the twins a withering look, and the hall's spirited applause instantly deflated into awkward hushes. After a tense moment, a tall, dark-robed wizard who bore an uncanny resemblance to Dumbledore, only in black robes, rose to speak. Clearing his throat, he said quietly, "I'm afraid our headmistress has made a rather obvious mistake." The hall waited, breath held, as he prepared to explain. "There's no definitive record of who first devised the enchantment that conceals our school's location, but it works perfectly. My name is Castor Pollock, and you might recognize my family name. My grandson, yes, the very Pollock you're already reading, wrote Advanced Potion Making and the Asian Anti-Poison Encyclopedia, both required texts for your 5th year. Now, about your next exam. The Group Potion Practical will be your 3rd major assessment, taking place next April. Its format will mirror the first 2 exams, and to prepare you, I will teach group potions every Saturday at 7 o'clock in the auditorium. You may address me as Professor Pollock." At that moment, the figure in black, an uncanny double of Professor Dumbledore, slid back into his seat. The real Dumbledore rose once more, his eyes dancing behind his glasses. With a broad smile, he spread his hands in a welcoming gesture. "And now, at long last, let us eat." As platters and goblets appeared, the students tucked in as if they'd been starved for weeks. Harry had barely settled when he realized Grindelwald was leaning close, ready to speak. All around them, house elves in the kitchens were working tirelessly, sending out course after course of lavish dishes until every table groaned with food. Harry had never seen such a sumptuous spread before them, dozens of dishes, many of which looked completely foreign. The ghosts, who had been hovering silently in midair, suddenly brightened at the sight of the feast and swooped down, silverware in hand. "What's that?" Ron asked, pointing to a gleaming platter piled high with shellfish beside a generous helping of steak and kidney pudding. His stomach growled in anticipation. "French fish soup," Harry answered. Ron's nose wrinkled in suspicion. "It looks a bit messy, and after what happened with Crumb, I'm not keen on trial-and-error dining." Harry laughed. "It's French, all right. Creature made it especially for me back at Sirius's. Honestly, it's delicious." "I'll trust you on this," Ron said grudgingly, ladling a piece of black pudding onto his plate. "But why haven't I ever had it at Sirius's place before?" Harry inclined his head toward Ginny, whom he was just serving a plate of pan-fried scallops with foie gras. "You must have forgotten. Creature's been in your house, too. House elves can't help picking up everyone's favorite dishes." Ron lifted his spoon of soup, took a cautious sip, and froze. Then his eyes lit up. "Blimey, Harry, you weren't kidding. This is brilliant." The auditorium felt unusually full, even though fewer than 20 students occupied its 3 long tables. Perhaps it was the burst of color that made it seem crowded. The scarlet robes of the Durmstrang students, the pale blue of Beauxbatons, and the bright green of Castrabush standing out sharply against Hogwarts' usual black. A Durmstrang student shrugged off his fur-lined cloak, revealing the deep red robes beneath. By candlelight, all those vivid hues seemed to glow. "It's her!" Ron dropped his knife and fork so suddenly Harry thought he might faint. Harry turned to follow his friend's pointing finger. Seated with the Beauxbatons delegation was the girl who had silenced the hall with a single glare when Maxime had mispronounced a spell. She was the same French student Harry had seen that morning at Flourish and Blot's. Now, with her scarf removed, a waterfall of silver hair tumbled past her waist. Her eyes were an impossible shade of blue, and when she smiled, Harry noticed her teeth were perfectly white and straight. She sat tall and graceful, the candlelight dancing across her features. Ouch! A sharp poke at Harry's side yanked him out of his daze. He looked down to see Ginny grinning up at him. Blushing, Harry scooped her into his arms. "I wasn't staring," he mumbled, casting an accusing look at Ron. "It's all his fault. He's the one who pointed her out." "I should tell you, she's part Vila," Mr. Weasley had once warned. "She's here." Ron's words came out in a strangled whisper. Harry swung his head around, every thought of Ginny vanishing, even though she stood right beside him, her hand resting on his arm. It felt impossible. He was supposed to be paying attention to her. But all he could focus on was the Beauxbatons girl striding into the great hall. Immediately, heads turned. Boys paused mid-bite, eyes wide, as though they'd never seen anyone so breathtaking. Even Ron, often brazen, looked unusually tongue-tied. Harry watched, heart-pounding, as the girl walked with purpose toward their table. Was this some challenge to Ravenclaw? A duel of wits? Or something more unpredictable? Harry's mind buzzed with scenarios: stand up for his house, issue a polite apology, even stage a clumsy spell to break the ice. He pictured himself gallantly defending Ravenclaw honor, yet also found himself strangely excited at the thought of sparring with her. Then a gentle voice cut through his racing thoughts. "Excuse me, may I sit here?" Harry's gaze snapped to Ron. The girl, calm, composed, utterly radiant, was addressing them directly. Ron's jaw dropped. Ginny, too, looked surprised. And there, right next to Ginny, sat an empty seat. Harry swallowed hard. This was going to be interesting. Harry glanced to his left, and for a moment his stomach dropped. Next to Ron's empty chair sat Ryan, fidgeting under the curious looks of the other Gryffindors. But now a pale Beauxbatons girl was perched beside him, chattering away as if she owned the place. Harry's heart twisted. Had she come all the way from France just to sit next to Ryan? He looked back at Luna and Hermione, searching for some clue that he'd misread the whole thing, but saw only sympathy in their faces. Ryan, catching Harry's gaze, offered him a nervous little wave and even proffered a glass of pumpkin juice. It felt like a declaration of doom. Ron, cheeks flaming, cleared his throat, picked up his plate and cutlery, and shuffled off to the empty seat beside Ginny. In an instant, everything changed. The other boys, who a heartbeat ago had been staring at the newcomer with such rapture, now looked decidedly less entranced. Ron, once freed from the girl's attentions, seemed almost relieved to be back beside his sister. Harry, however, was left witnessing a private scene. Ryan and the Beauxbatons girl leaned toward each other, whispering and laughing in intimate tones. He could see every flicker of their conversation, yet no word reached his ears. All he could do was watch as they traded glances that once had been his alone. Chapter 19, The Changes of Ghosts. "What are you doing?" Ginny's voice was barely more than a whisper, but her cheeks flamed so brightly Harry could have sworn they'd glow in the dim lantern light. He froze, arms still around her, as the realization struck him like a rogue bludger. He'd completely forgotten she was there. A tide of guilt washed over him, and a surprising relief. If Ryan's glamour had faltered for even a second, everyone in the Great Hall would have been staring at him and the elegant Beauxbatons witch instead of at his blushing sister. Thank Merlin for that minor miracle. Ginny slipped free of his embrace and darted back to her seat, smoothing her robes as if still wishing to hide. Harry's heart pounded. He hadn't meant to startle her. Clearing his throat, he plastered on a casual grin. "Here," he said, scooping a fresh bowl of Provençal fish soup from the counter and setting it before her. "I thought you might like a refill." Ginny blinked up at him, her stern expression softening into something almost reluctant, something like a smile. Before Harry could say more, Ryan appeared at his side, bearing a heaping plate of fish and chips. He vanished into his usual easy grin. "All right here?" he asked, nudging his tray across the table. "By the way, where's Gabrielle? I thought she'd be joining us." Fleur, lounging across from Ginny, snorted and rolled her eyes. "Gabrielle?" she repeated. "Oh, she was so excited. Couldn't sleep a wink last night. She was convinced she'd get to see you today," she told Ryan with a teasing tilt of her head. "Her parents nearly bit her head off. They've never seen her act so unladylike." Ginny's cheeks flared again, but this time she laughed, a soft, genuine sound. Harry felt the tension ebb away. The ghosts of awkward moments past were shifting, and for now, peace had settled over their little corner of the hall. Fleur frowned. "Because of a delay, I can't get to Hogwarts until next month." Ryan waved his hand dismissively. "It's just a matter of staying up late. Hardly a crisis, you and I." He clapped his hands twice, and Fleur pretended to scold him. "You're terrible." "But you love it," he teased, grinning. After a moment's playfulness, Fleur's lip curled into a pout. "Well, where's my praise? I've been waiting forever." Ryan shrugged. "Ravenclaw isn't nearly as impressive as people say. If I hadn't stepped in, little Luna would have been kicked out the way Maxim, the so-called founder of Beauxbatons, truly deserved to be." Fleur huffed in mock indignation, but Ryan simply leaned over, resting his head against her shoulder. Quietly, he murmured, "Still, you'll get your reward. Tonight, I'm all yours." Gently, he placed his left hand at the nape of her neck. Instantly, Fleur felt a warm rush of information slide into her mind. The secret passage into the room of requirement, the precise time of their meeting, even the password they would need. Meanwhile, Harry sat not far away, unsettled. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest. Had Ryan planned all of this? Across the room, Ginny hovered, completely unaware of what had just transpired, offering him another sandwich with a cheerful smile. At that moment, Harry realized he had been entangled in the Bowden's girl's subtle charm, and he broke free, determined not to be led by enchantments any longer. Harry felt as though invisible weights pinched at his neck, pressing his head down. Even after the last bite of the main course, dessert did nothing to lift his mood. "Here, Harry, try this," Ginny said, sliding a small dish of pale, wobbly milk jelly across the table. "I just tasted it. It's amazing." Then she added another plate piled high with syrupy fruit tarts. "And this is your favorite." All around them, the great hall buzzed with contented chatter as students savored the novel sweets. But at Harry's table, a quiet tension held sway. He pushed the jelly aside, staring at the carved wooden surface, guilt knotting his stomach. Ginny watched him with soft concern. Ron, finally finishing his own dessert, craned his neck, at a glance at Victor Crumb over at the Durmstrang table. On Harry's other side, Lisa Dupin and Padma Patil nibbled at their plates, conspicuously slower than everyone else. "By the way," Michael Corner piped up from across Harry's left, directly opposite the Beauxbatons girl, "where's Lady Grey tonight? I'd give anything for her company." He tilted his head, eyes drifting to the vaulted ceiling. "I want to talk poetry and music, maybe even go stargazing by the lake." Terry Boot, ever the stargazer, reached out as if charting constellations. "She did promise to show me some celestial navigation tricks," he said with a hopeful glance around the room, "but I haven't spotted her yet." Harry forced a small nod. Even as the hall buzzed with laughter and clinking cutlery, he felt a gulf of silence settle over his own thoughts. Ghosts now look so much like the living that their whole outlook has changed. Every spirit here wants to befriend the high mountains blossom, Lady Grey. "Good evening. I heard your name brought up in connection with Lady Grey." A moment later, Nick, head almost severed, floated down clutching a glass of pale translucent liquor. Michael and Terry both nodded eagerly. "Hold on, wipe that off." Nick closed his eyes and murmured under his breath. In a burst of soft white light, the smear of crimson sauce on Terry's mouth vanished. "You can do magic without a wand?" Michael asked in astonishment. "We all can," Nick replied with a shrug. "It's almost exactly as when we were alive. But there's a catch. We have to prepare the magic beforehand. Formulate it, you might say. If we skip that step, the spell simply doesn't exist." Nick rubbed the side of his throat, where his neck still hung partly loose. "Lady Grey's been studying this intensely. As Ravenclaw's daughter, she feels it's her duty to carry on her mother's work, discover why our magic behaves this way. Could it be that we ghosts aren't drawing in enough energy? Why don't we have to excrete? And when will we be able to touch the living?" came a mischievous voice from above. Its sudden volume startled the phantom hounds into disappointed whines. At that moment, Nick reached out a translucent finger and pressed it gently against Terry's cheek. To everyone's surprise, the finger slipped right through, yet Terry only winced in wonder, not in pain. "Wow, that's different!" Terry exclaimed, brushing his hand over the warm, tingling spot. Before, phasing through someone felt like dumping a bucket of ice water over them. Now it's like a comforting warm current pulsing through my veins. Nick glanced around the room, noting that none of the other students looked chilled or uncomfortable. Indeed, our usual presence carries a frigid aura, enough to give living people the chills, but right now, he snapped open a ghostly transparent notebook. "I need to record this. It could be a major discovery. Child, what's your name? If this holds up, you might even earn a mention in Ghost Weekly." Terry's face flushed. He hesitated, then said, "Terry Boot." "Boot?" Nick's pen hovered over the page. "Any relation to Weber Boot?" Terry nodded. "And tell me, why aren't you in the United States?" Nick asked, curiosity shining in his ethereal eyes as he prepared to jot down every detail. Although Ilvermorny's School of Witchcraft and Wizardry doesn't match Hogwarts in prestige, considering its distance and its founders, it's still remarkably accomplished. After all, it was established by direct descendants of the four great founders. Nick leaned across the Slytherin table toward Michael and Terry and lowered his voice. "Our family actually comes from Ireland," he began. "On an expedition to North America, My great-great-grandfather and his brother Chadwick were ambushed. Both of their parents died, and the boys were rescued by Isolde Sayre, a direct descendant of Salazar Slytherin, who adopted them. Michael flipped through a small notebook. That explains the boot name you mentioned earlier. The Boots, or more precisely the Weber boot line, are Chadwick Boots' descendants. They stayed in the States while our branch returned home to Britain. Terry sat up straighter, pride lighting his eyes. I suppose that makes me a true Brit at heart. Nothing hits the spot like fish and chips. Nick tapped his pen against a ledger. All right, I'll update our records with the Weber boot descendants. Harry, who'd been pretending to study Transfiguration while eavesdropping, couldn't hold back any longer. Okay, but what's this about the Ghost Weekly? Chapter 120. The strange Harry sat before a single sheet of bizarre milky white paper, more like a translucent page than a newspaper, titled Ghost Weekly. Its cover story featured a naked skeleton, boldly proclaimed the most beautiful ghost in Yacht County. According to the article, her graceful animated bones had drawn a host of headless ghost hunters, each mesmerized by her eerie elegance. Scattered beneath the photograph were comments from spirits around the world. Daring, unbelievably seductive. She truly deserves the title of most beautiful ghost. My brother, cursed for 1,000 years, seems to have found new life. Just look at that perfectly rounded jaw. This is indecent. Harry blinked, bewildered. How could these disembodied souls fixate on such macabre details? Each remark seemed stranger than the last. He set the paper down with a soft sigh. Done yet? Asked Nick, whose own head hovered precariously above his shoulders. I'm turning the page. Nick flipped the translucent sheet. Harry leaned forward at once. The next feature was a full-page portrait of a knight, an arrow protruding from the center of his forehead. Harry's pulse quickened. He'd seen that exact face just weeks ago, at Nick's death anniversary dinner. The memory sent a chill through him. Why would this ghostly gazette dredge up someone so intimately tied to their past? Harry stared in fascination at the moving photograph before him. On the left, an arrow jutted from a knight's forehead. Yet he drew the shaft out as calmly as if he were plucking a feather from the wind, raised his translucent elm longbow, and loosed the missile straight back into the fray. On the right, another knight bore a heavy broadsword plunged deep into his chest. Without a moment's hesitation, he grasped the blade by its gleaming hilt, tore it free, and used the tip to deflect a hail of incoming arrows. Neither combatant wore a crest, banner, or title. The image was untitled. Below, the comments rolled on in an endless, bizarre stream. Some viewers fawned over the knight's honorable deaths, as though applauding a masterful performance. Others critiqued their armor. That hauberk doesn't even fit him, right? Someone scoffed, while a few insisted the two looked like star-crossed lovers. Only one commenter remarked on their martial skill. Watch Cavan's draw. That archery stance is stunning. Harry scrolled through the rest of Ghost Weekly, and a pattern emerged. Whenever an article featured a female apparition at its center, the comments turned into nothing but adoring praise, regardless of the ghost's deeds or the horrors she'd wrought. Spectral men were dissected for technique, costume, even body language. Spectral women, however, received collective swoons and glowing nicknames: the Rose of Ravenswood, Mistress of Moonlight, our beloved bride. The contrast was so stark it made Harry's skin prickle. He leaned back, considering how differently these spirits were being treated online. Accuracy, talent, cruelty, all were overshadowed by a single factor: gender. And if a ghost story happened to star a woman, well, Ghost Weekly readers would forgive nearly anything. Once you switch the gender, the evaluations stop lining up and start going off in every direction, Nick muttered, folding the newspaper. Terry, who'd been skimming the same article, frowned. Why are they all comments? Nick's voice dropped even lower. If a paper's editor-in-chief and readership remained exactly the same for millennia, this is exactly what would happen eventually. Harry, overhearing, felt a surge of relief. At least Ron was still hanging on to every word Crumb said. Otherwise, Harry would have been peppering him with questions by now. After an indeterminate stretch of time, long enough that Harry nearly dozed off, the enchanted ceiling finally cleared of its raging tempest. A placid night sky glittered above with stars. The golden plates on the tables sparkled as well, scrubbed clean and perfectly polished. Albus Dumbledore rose from his seat, and the entire great hall fell silent. Harry stifled a yawn, imagining his cozy four-poster waiting for him somewhere upstairs. Soft blankets, warm pillows. Then, thwack! A brisk shove to his back yanked him fully awake. The comforting warmth he'd felt wasn't coming from his bed, but from Ginny, who was pressed up against him, her cheeks blazing as though she were about to burst into steam. Behind her, Ron shot Harry a dark glare of outright irritation. Ron must have given him a nudge, because Harry cleared his throat and sat up as Professor Dumbledore stood at the head of the table. The great hall fell into an expectant hush. "Now, since we've all just enjoyed another rather substantial feast," Dumbledore began, his voice warm and clear, "I would ask you to lend me your attention while I outline the usual precautions for the new term." His pale blue eyes gleamed with amusement as he looked down at the first-year students seated nearest him. Although our senior pupils are already well acquainted with this rule, it bears repeating for those in their first year. Under no circumstances are you to enter the Forbidden Forest. A shout rang out from the Weasley twins. "But we haven't been in there all year," George protested. "Then make up for it this year," Fred added, earning a severe glare from Professor McGonagall, who sat stiffly beside Dumbledore. The headmaster allowed himself a small smile. "In addition," he said, "Mr. Filch, who assures me this is the 426th reminder, has asked me to stress that dueling in the corridors between classes is strictly forbidden." Harry leaned toward Ron and whispered, "Dueling? That's not just doing magic, is it?" Ron shrugged, a grin tugging at his lips. "Well, now that Filch used to be a wizard himself, I suppose he's less likely to complain about the odd spell." Dumbledore cleared his throat softly. "You will find a detailed definition of dueling, along with many other regulations, posted on the notice board outside Mr. Filch's office. Now," he paused, surveying the hall, "let us continue." A hush settled once more as Dumbledore prepared to speak on. "This year, we have one change to announce in our teaching staff," Professor Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eye. "Our Care of Magical Creatures professor, Wilhelmina Kettleburn, retired at the end of last term. He felt it was time to spend more of his days at ease and fewer dangling by a dragon's claw. I'm delighted, however, to introduce his successor, Rubus Hagrid, who will continue his duties as gamekeeper while taking on the role of Care of Magical Creatures instructor." A roar of approval shattered the hush of the great hall. Harry, Hermione, and Ron leapt to their feet, Harry's face lighting up with genuine delight, Hermione's hand firmly clasping Ron's. Even Ron's gaze drifted away from Victor Krum long enough to join in the applause. Across the hall, the Durmstrang students responded with only polite clapping, while their tutors exchanged bemused glances. At the Beauxbatons table, the headmistress and her students, lagging only a heartbeat behind the Hogwarts cheering, rose to their feet in tribute. Nearby, the contingent from Castel Pollak, who had known Hagrid for years, led their students in a vigorous ovation of their own. In an instant, thunderous applause swept through the entire hall, echoing off the enchanted ceiling and ensuring that Rubus Hagrid's triumphant return to the classroom would be remembered for years to come. Harry leaned forward to peer at Hagrid. His friend's cheeks were flushed bright red, and he kept staring at his enormous hands, as if afraid they might give him away. Hagrid's wide, sheepish grin was half hidden beneath his tangled black beard. Beside him, Madame Maxime tilted her head in much the same way Grindel had just done, her large eyes sparkling with delight. Hagrid must have felt those admiring looks, because he looked moments away from swooning. In fact, after the applause died down, he didn't shed another tear. A small mercy, certainly, given how much he'd to face in front of the girls. At that moment, Dumbledore cleared his throat and spoke once more. "It's growing late, and we've a busy day ahead of us. I expect everyone to be well rested, for tomorrow's lessons will require sharp wits. So off to bed, please." At his words, tables and benches clattered as students from the other three houses sprang to their feet and filed out of the great hall. Harry hustled after Ron. "Don't worry, mate," he said quietly. "You've got another whole year. Plenty of time to make your mark." Ron gave a rueful grin, shrugged off his disappointment, and followed the stream of students out into the castle's corridors. Together with the Ravenclaw contingent, they mounted the gleaming marble staircase and climbed toward the 6th floor, already half dreaming of beds and tomorrow's new adventures. Upon reaching the 6th floor, they passed beneath a gleaming, newly installed suit of armor, more like a grand archway than protective gear, and found themselves staring at another spiral staircase that seemed to coil on forever. A sense of dread washed over them. Perhaps they'd already arrived too late. Typically, students at the front would halt to answer the proctor's questions while those at the back waited anxiously for their turn. But today, once the first voices rang out, the remaining students abandoned their customary resistance. Rather than press forward to speak, they simply fell in behind the crowd and filed into the hall. Chapter 121. Animagus Harry felt as though he'd been plucked from a dream. When he fully woke, he was lying in his own familiar dormitory. A freshly hung sign on the door proclaimed in gold letters, "Third year." He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly the same. The dark blue carpet stamped with stars and moons, the tall, narrow windows framed in blue and bronze silk, the gleaming gilt letters on each wooden trunk, and the heavy navy flannel curtains draping every four-poster bed. Even Hedwig was there, peering out from her cage with the door hanging ajar, as if greeting him back home. Harry sank into his mattress, letting the softness cradle his tired body. After a moment to gather his thoughts, he looked around. To his left, Ryan's bed in the corner was empty. On his right, Ron was already fast asleep, breathing softly. Neville lay curled up under his covers, and Anthony, Michael, and Terry had each dozed off the moment they hit their mattresses. He frowned, recalling the Beauxbatons girl he'd spotted in the crowd, the one who'd slipped away and followed a different Ryan up the stairs. So his own Ryan wouldn't be coming back tonight, after all. A small pang of disappointment flitted through him. Harry drew in a steadying breath. He was about to ask about the resurrection ceremony, this strange ritual that had haunted his thoughts ever since, when exhaustion finally claimed him. With one last glance at his friends, he closed his eyes and surrendered to sleep, determined that tomorrow he'd get the answers he sought. Harry hadn't seen Ryan for several months. The next morning, the storm finally eased, but the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall remained shrouded in those same heavy blue-gray clouds. Harry, Ginny, and Neville sat at the Gryffindor table, tucking into breakfast and studying their timetables for the new term as thunderheads rolled overhead. Across the hall, Draco Malfoy, bound to a different schedule as a Slytherin, was deep in conversation with Pansy Parkinson, Crabbe, and Goyle at their own table. Ron, restless, grabbed a quick plate of food and slipped outside toward the Black Lake, where the Durmstrang ship still lay moored against its shores. At a nearby bench, Fred and George Weasley flanked Lee Jordan, hatching plans for their latest venture. "We need a fair referee," Fred insisted, waving his parchment, "and we've got to convince him to sign off on our new Warriors team." George peered at his schedule. "Today's not too bad. Just Transfiguration this morning, and then Divination." Fred groaned. "Ron will hate that. Core classes like Transfiguration and Charms are all sorted by house again, so he won't be in Lavender's class either." Neville slid a finger down the Monday column. "And in the afternoon, we've got Charms." He looked up, meeting Harry's eyes. "Ready for it?" Harry closed his book with a decisive snap. "As ready as I'll ever be." Harry stared down at his timetable, frowning. "I'm still not sure which new spells to learn. Care of Magical Creatures with Hagrid wasn't bad. At least you get to be outside with the Hufflepuffs." Ron peered over his shoulder. "Honestly, Gryffindor is the better choice. Seamus said their first class is Divination." A groan escaped Harry's lips. Divination, reading tea leaves, gazing into crystal balls, was exactly the kind of subject he'd been dying to take. He hardly had time to feel disappointed before a strange flutter ran through him. He looked up and saw Ryan from Beauxbatons walking toward the school tables, a Beauxbatons girl holding his left arm as they chatted. Then Harry's jaw dropped. At the opposite end of the hall was another Ryan, bent over a parchment, studying the course list with the same intensity Hermione showed in the library. Yet neither boy nor either girl seemed to notice the other pair, as if only Harry could see both of them. They moved like ghosts, oblivious to the rest of the hall and to one another. "If only I could split myself in two like that," Harry muttered. Ginny slid in beside him, eyebrows raw-eyed. Split yourself? What on earth are you talking about? Harry managed a half smile. I just saw 2 Ryans. Imagine if I could duplicate myself. Think how many more books I'd get through. Harry could say the same about Ginny and Neville. Both of them already knew that Ryan existed. Ginny gave him a fond, understanding look. If it were me, she said, I'd split them up, let one stay here with Harry. After all, I'm only in my 2nd year and my schedule's completely different. Neville, the perennial single, slumped in brief despair at Ginny's casual suggestion, but his mood lifted the moment he remembered their Care of Magical Creatures class that afternoon. Before anyone could speak again, a familiar voice piped up from nearby. If it were me, I'd keep one right by the Black Lake. Kayla Moo! Harry cleared his throat and turned to Ron, whose shoulders were still slumped. Ron, you didn't manage to find Crumb and sort out that misunderstanding, did you? He couldn't hide a flicker of relief. He'd suspected that Ginny wouldn't buy Ron's excuse. Ron's frown deepened. No, he's a coward. I've been watching that ship for ages, and I never once saw him leave it. He launched into a litany of every hour he'd wasted tailing Crumb, his complaints running on non-stop. His sour mood cast a brief, uneasy cloud over the group. Fortunately, the day moved on, and at least it wasn't Saturday or Sunday. The bell had barely finished ringing when Harry, Ron, and Neville trudged toward the long-unused Transfiguration classroom. Ron grumbled all the way, but Harry barely heard him. He was too busy noticing that they were the only Gryffindors filing in. Normally, Harry would slip into class with the rest of the students so that Peeves wouldn't pester him, but today only Ron and Neville had joined him. Harry dropped into the back row just as Professor McGonagall glided in. Good morning, she said crisply. Please open your copies of Intermediate Transfiguration to page 3. Today we begin our study of the Animagus. She paused to ensure everyone was settled. An Animagus cannot transform into just any creature at will. The animal form chosen is directly linked to the wizard's personality and inner nature. Typically, a witch or wizard may learn only one Animagus form in their lifetime. There is, however, one notable exception, the Animagi trained at the Ogado School of Magic in Africa. Those wizards can shift at will between elephants and cheetahs. Even so, they cannot overcome the central limitation of this magic. Animagi may assume only the shapes of non-magical animals. Attempts to transform into a magical creature, whether a phoenix, a dragon, or a hippogriff, lead to wildly unpredictable and often dangerous consequences. As McGonagall began outlining the registration process for Animagi, Harry leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Learning to become an animagus was a painstaking, rarely mastered art, but it was about to become very important to him. Contemporary scholarship, as reflected in leading journals like Transfiguration Today and the Proceedings of the International Animagus Symposium, maintains that wizarding magic and the innate magic of magical creatures operate on fundamentally different principles. You may have noticed that no standard textbook offers a step-by-step guide to becoming an animagus. They provide only a broad overview. In truth, the transformation is more akin to a ritual, and a perilous one at that. On your first attempt, you risk becoming ensnared in the tug-of-war between human consciousness and animal instinct. Practitioners often report hearing a second heartbeat, lose control for even a moment, and you may tip irreversibly toward the animal side, convinced from then on that you are, say, a badger rather than a human being. Even if you're fortunate enough to reclaim your humanity, you'll never be entirely the same. Lingering habits, altered reflexes, and in extreme cases, residual physical traits can remain. Turn to page 5 for a cautionary tale. Wells' Fat Man Wei Li, the most infamous animagus failure, on record. Wei Li's transformation left him almost a sheep. He could still walk upright and speak, but otherwise he behaved entirely like the flock. One afternoon, overcome by his ovine instincts, he grazed himself to sleep in a meadow. When he finally awoke, he discovered a startled muggle straddling him, and his trousers vanished somewhere in the grass. Gasps echoed through the classroom as Professor McGonagall raised an eyebrow. Transforming yourself into an animal may seem deceptively simple, she began, her voice stern, but one slip, one moment of lost control, and you risk far graver consequences than a broken bone. That's why the Ministry of Magic enforces strict regulations. Every animagus must register their chosen animal form and its unique characteristics with the Misuse of Magic Office. Chapter 565, The Birth Rate in the Wizarding World is Declining. I will fix it. A hushed murmur rippled through the great hall the moment the announcement rang out. On the raised dice, Professor McGonagall, currently assuming her tabby cat animagus form, paused mid-sentence, her bright green eyes distant. Normally, she would have hesitated to share the darker details of Willie the Welsh sheepman's humiliation at the hands of Muggles with her third-year students. But judging by the whispered glances and knowing smiles around her, McGonagall realized how outdated her own assumptions had become. Today's students were far more worldly. They'd already encountered every scandal the wizarding world had to offer. She chastised herself. In Ron Weasley's first year, there had been that notorious spat involving Harry and Neville, an incident that had set all of Hogwarts abuzz. Then, Harry Potter himself had rushed into an engagement, and Ron's own romance with Lavender Brown. To McGonagall, it had always felt more like Ron hiding behind a shield than actually courting her. Meanwhile, his easy intimacy with Harry had long struck the professor as unconventional, to say the least. And of course, at the root of it all stood Albus Dumbledore. With his gentle encouragement of emotional openness, he'd never drawn a firm line between friendship and something deeper. McGonagall could only shake her head. If Hogwarts couldn't teach its students clear boundaries, was it any wonder that the very future of the wizarding population was at risk? Gathering her composure, she rose gracefully to her pause. "My apologies," she began in her crisp, authoritative tone. "Let us return to the matter at hand. The decline in our birth rate is no mere coincidence, and it falls to each of us, instructors and students alike, to ensure the next generation of witches and wizards can thrive." With that, the whispers died away. McGonagall's tail twitched in determination. If she had to set aside her old-fashioned ways to tackle this problem head-on, so be it. The future of magic depended on nothing less. That year, Newt surprised everyone by returning to Hogwarts with his lover, once imprisoned and now quietly at his side. Even at evening dinners, they sat cheek by jowl, stealing glances, sharing kisses so openly that Professor McGonagall could hardly ignore what was going on. If anything, it only confirmed the whispers she'd been hearing all term. According to the rumors, Newt's earlier expulsion and hasty departure for America had been a bid to escape Albus Dumbledore's scrutiny. Back then, Headmaster Armando had been only too willing to oblige. He'd recognized Dumbledore's own uncertain motives in the wake of his split from Grindelwald and had briskly shown Newt the door. Newt, for his part, probably assumed that once Dumbledore had captured Grindelwald, he'd no longer trouble him. So he settled in the States, fell in love, and, risking everything, answered Dumbledore's call to return to Europe and fight in the war against Grindelwald's rising darkness. By 1945, it was done. Dumbledore had defeated Grindelwald and locked him away in Nurmengard. With his old enemy finally subdued, Newt felt free to meet Dumbledore face to face again. No more running, no more lies. But peace proved short-lived. A darker threat emerged in the form of Tom Riddle, soon to be known as Lord Voldemort. Many said that Dumbledore's own ambitions had steered Riddle toward evil, that Albus had been searching for a powerful protege ever since Grindelwald's power began to wane. Hungry for someone strong enough to shape the future of wizardkind, Dumbledore found in Riddle exactly the tool he needed, until Riddle outgrew the care that once molded him. And now the school was once again caught in the crossfire of destinies far larger than any of them. McGonagall watched Newt and his lover, free, defiant, and unashamed, and wondered just how deep the mysteries she'd unearthed really went. In order to safeguard his purity and satisfy his unquenchable ambition, Tom Riddle took on the mantle of Ardid Voldemort. Severus Snape's decision to join the Order of the Phoenix, it turned out, was no mere act of conscience. It was Dumbledore's quiet insistence that Snape study an experimental potion for restoring male fertility. The headmaster harbored a long-held wish to father children with Gellert Grindelwald, and in this strange scheme, the very existence of Riddle as Voldemort served as Dumbledore's way of atoning for his greatest regret, that he had never truly conquered his dark counterpart. Minerva McGonagall sat in transfiguration, her mind racing like a runaway stallion. Across the front row, Ryan, seated beside Hermione, nodded to himself with a self-satisfied grin. Centuries ago, he had slipped back through time to plant these rumors, absurd, unbelievable tales that no one at first would grant a second thought. Always mindful not to warp history's unfolding, he'd used subtle magic to keep them hidden in the wizarding world's collective subconscious. Now, at last, the moment had come for his painstaking work to bear fruit. Hundreds of years' worth of scattered whispers were finally drawing together into a single pattern. In the hearts and minds of those who had listened, the real Albus Dumbledore would at last stand revealed. Professor McGonagall shifted abruptly from her tabby cat form back into human shape, her robes settling around her as the classroom fell into a hushed silence. She surveyed her students with a quiet intensity before speaking. Before we resume our lesson, a few recent developments in the magical world demand mention, she began. First, you've undoubtedly heard that Professor Snape, quite by accident, forwarded a perfected potion formula to the Department of Advanced Potions. It's designed to restore male fertility, just what a community with our plummeting birth rate desperately needs. Some are already hailing him as the savior of the wizarding line. Even Dumbledore, that old trickster, can't seem to steal all the credit this time. A ripple of laughter passed among the students. McGonagall allowed herself a brief, knowing smile before continuing. But that pale potion pales next to a far more astonishing breakthrough, a new class of animagus transformation, dubbed the Fenrir Avatar. By deliberately contracting lycanthropy under controlled conditions, a witcher wizard gains not only a wolf's physique, but the power to shift fully into wolf form at will, while retaining every ounce of their magical skill. Remarkably, even squibs have managed to unlock latent magical abilities through this process. It's a quantum leap in transfiguration. Who can say what wonders lie ahead? Perhaps one day, just imagine, we'll discover a way for muggles to attain real wizarding power through physical metamorphosis. At the back of the room, Ryan sneered and folded his arms. Let's be realistic, he muttered. Muggles will never become true wizards. The very essence of our magic transcends them. Not even demigods or so-called divine wizards have reached this level of mastery. And don't forget Dudley Dursley. He never actually became a wizard. He survived only by merging his soul with that of a true magical practitioner. McGonagall raised a single eyebrow, but said nothing more. The room hung on her every word, the weight of possibility and impossibility heavy in the air. They had been debating how to defeat a wizard who could summon natural phenomena, yet couldn't bend reality itself. The consensus was clear. The answer lay in the existing magic system, especially in the use of magical creatures. Professor McGonagall's calm voice cut through the murmurs. For your next assignment, I want each of you to write an essay on the precautions required for becoming an animagus and the possible directions its study might take. Aim for about 1 page and hand it in by Friday morning. Class dismissed. Desks scraped and books were tucked away as the students rose. Once the last Gryffindors had filed out and McGonagall had departed, Ron heaved a frustrated sigh. I still don't get it, he complained to Harry as they head into the corridor. Why are only students from one house allowed to take divination? Harry glanced at his schedule. Come on, let's hurry. Divination's on the top floor of the North Tower. It'll take at least 10 minutes to get there. Before Ron could argue, Neville caught up, breathless but excited. Harry, I just found out why the rest didn't follow you. Ron looked between them in surprise. Why not? Neville grinned. There are students here from other wizarding schools now, and they don't want to be thought of as cowards. They already think they're practically adults in year 3, Neville grumbled as he slung his satchel over his shoulder. They shouldn't be afraid of Peeves anymore, after all. Harry looked up. Are you actually looking forward to divination? Neville asked. Definitely, Harry replied, tucking a loose strand of hair behind his ear. Professor Trelawney is the great-great-granddaughter of the famous Cassandra Trelawney. Everyone says she's brilliant. No sooner had he spoken than the staircase before them vanished. With a quick spring, Harry cleared the gap, landing gracefully on the next step. Ron and Neville followed, scrambling after him. You should have heard about her back in first year, Neville said as they hurried down the corridor. My grandmother and Professor McGonagall are old friends, McGonagall's told me all about Trelawney's unique talents. You'll want to be prepared, Harry, especially now that you're so famous." At lunchtime in the Great Hall, Harry sat staring vacantly at his untouched stew. His eyes were glassy, and he barely registered the bustle around him. Ginny slid onto the bench beside him. "What's the matter, Harry?" she asked gently. Before he could answer, Ron chomped into a chunk of pickled fish and shot his brother a warning look. "Don't even ask," he muttered through a mouthful. Neville, who'd come to join them, glanced around at their peers. At nearby tables, students were exchanging nervous whispers and furtive glances, as though suspense itself were about to strike. Neville let out a sigh. "Professor Trelawney had quite the performance today," he said. "She broke her own record for the number of predictions she's ever made in one class. You'll hear the full story at breakfast tomorrow." Professor Trelawney peered into the tea leaves at the bottom of Harry's and Ron's cups, her pale face drawn tight. "Ominous," she whispered. "The worst omen, the omen of death." I rolled my eyes. It sounded ridiculous. Grandmother always said Seer Trelawney predicted a student's death every year she'd taught at Hogwarts. But this time, apparently, there were two. "I know why," Ron muttered, scowling. Trelawney had been openly hostile to him lately, convinced he wasn't a suitable match for Lavender Brown. Lavender, of course, was Trelawney's favorite, handpicked as the professor's special protégé back in their second year. All at once, the classroom felt colder and more dangerous than ever before. Chapter 566, Shock-Absorbing Curse. After lunch, Ron vanished again. Harry and Hermione headed straight back to the Ravenclaw common room to prep for their afternoon classes, but Ron lingered in the castle's entrance hall, eyes fixed on the surface of the Black Lake. In the distance, the large Triwizard ship bobbed gently, and he was certain Victor Krum would be stepping off at any moment. He scanned every figure descending the gangplank, but there was no sign of the Bulgarian champion. Krum seemed determined to avoid him altogether. By the time Ron made it into Charms, his hopes of catching Krum had all but evaporated. He slumped into a desk just as Neville arrived beside him, a teasing grin on his face. "I heard Krum's already got hold of the Ravenclaw third-year schedule," Neville said quietly, waggling his head toward the front of the classroom. "He even asked about which electives you signed up for. Face it, Ron, you'll never manage to tail him without skipping all your classes, unless, of course, you fancy turning into a Hogwarts truant." Ron stared at his empty desk, then let out a frustrated sigh. "So Krum can read Gryffindor's timetable just as easily?" He ran a hand through his hair. "And I thought I'd outsmarted him by keeping tabs on him in the foyer. I've been so busy ogling Krum, I've completely ignored Lavender's texts. No wonder he's got the drop on me." Neville chuckled and patted Ron's arm. "Better luck next time. At least you know now." Grateful, Ron seized Neville's hand. "Thanks, mate. Seriously." No sooner had he said it than the classroom bell rang. Professor Flitwick popped up from beneath his lectern, as if he'd been crouching there to spring on them, and cleared his throat in his high, cheerful voice. "All right, everyone. Take out your wands. Today we'll be practicing the cushioning charm, sometimes called the shock-absorbing curse. Please form pairs." As Ron exchanged a surprising glance with Neville, he made a mental note. Next time, he'd keep one eye on his girlfriend and the other on Krum. After all, there was more to life at Hogwarts than chasing after the Bulgarian star. Professor Phileas Flitwick surveyed his students from atop a teetering stack of textbooks and nodded in satisfaction. Clearly they'd behaved while he was away. After a swift roll call, he tapped his wand on the floor and said, "Please open your standard spells, level 3, to page 2. Today's lesson is the cushioning charm, sometimes simply called the cushion charm. Elio Smesek invented it in 1820 to soften broomsticks and make flights more comfortable." He paused, smiling beneath his bushy mustache. "Yet its proper name is the shock-absorbing charm. Can anyone tell me why? Harry?" Harry Potter stood and met the professor's gaze. "Because it doesn't actually create a cushion of air," he said. "Instead, it enchants the target's surface so it absorbs impact." In Hogwarts' earliest Quidditch matches, professors charmed the pitch itself. But as more Gryffindors began soaring ever higher and then leaping down, the repeated force eventually nullified the spell. "Exactly right," Flitwick exclaimed, raising a hand to award 5 points to Ravenclaw. He drew his wand again, let out a quick extension, and watched with delight as the pile of books underneath him shot upward another foot. Chapter: The Invisible Extension Spell. Professor Flitwick stood before the class, wand at the ready, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. Today, he announced, we'll learn how to expand and reinforce an entire space, ideal for everything from secret hideaways to makeshift training arenas. Witness the Invisible Extension Spell. With a precise flick of his wand and a soft incantation, the room itself began to transform. The low, 10-foot ceiling soared upward until it nearly grazed 80 feet above their heads. Backbenches shifted imperceptibly away from the walls, giving everyone extra elbow room. From Harry's vantage point in the last row, it felt as though the castle walls were receding into the distance. Flitwick tapped his wand twick. More. The heap of textbooks and parchment on the teacher's desk swelled in size, then leapt into the air. They arranged themselves neatly into a grand, spiraling staircase that wrapped around the edges of the classroom, its steps composed entirely of floating books. Now for the finishing touch, the professor said with a flourish. Cushioning maxima. A wave of shimmering light spread across every surface. Harry, intrigued, reached out and pressed the fingertips of his right hand against the desktop. To his surprise, the wood gave way like soft leather, then rebounded under his palm. Pliable, springy, and unexpectedly luxurious. He bounced lightly on the floor. It yielded beneath his weight, then gently propelled him back up. The sensation reminded him of lounging on the most comfortable sofa in Hogsmeade, only even springier. Harry smiled broadly. He could see why wizards trusted their nimbus brooms to cushion them on a rough landing. Flitwick caught Harry's expression and nodded approvingly. Excellent observation, Harry. As you've discovered, the entire room is now under a powerful shock absorption enchantment. Go on, climb the staircase, leap from the steps, experiment with your landings. Feel free to test its limits. A ripple of excitement swept through the class. Harry sprang to his feet and bounded toward the floating books, ready to experience for himself just how far cushioning maxima could go. The invisible extension spell had turned an ordinary lesson into a playground of magic, and Harry couldn't wait to see what came next. The moment Professor Flitwick's spell took effect, the entire classroom erupted in jumps and bounces, as if someone had turned their desks and benches into giant muggle trampolines. Even Ron, usually more interested in lavender than in charms, surrendered to the fun and leapt about with everyone else. When the bell finally rang, no one moved. A foot-long essay assignment from Professor Flitwick failed to draw so much as a glance. With a resigned sigh, Flitwick waved his wand and returned the room to its proper order. The students gathered their things at last, still dazed by the adrenaline rush. Suddenly, Neville spotted Ron bolting for the door. "Ron, where are you going?" he shouted. Ron spun around in the corridor, eyes glinting. "I'm starving. Gryffindor's just finished Care of Magical Creatures in the Great Hall. See you there." And with that, he was gone. Neville exchanged a look with Harry. "We'd better follow," he said. "If that prat Crumb is hanging around Lavender again, Ron might have to step in. And I've been dying to ask Ron something anyway." Moments later, Harry and Neville raced down the marble staircase to the first floor, then out into the cool afternoon air. 10 minutes after that, they came around the far side of the castle to the Black Lake's shore, where a small circle of bright green-clad students had gathered around Victor Krum. Harry and Neville finally caught up with Ron just off the shore of the Black Lake. Lavender had her arms draped around Ron's waist, half listening to the conversation, while Parvati hovered anxiously at his other side. In the distance, the massive ship awaited its passengers on the dark, still water. "Glad you two made it," Harry said, relief softening his tone. He turned first to Ron. "Got a question, though. Are you worried you can't beat Krum?" Ron shot Harry an unconvincing look and then glanced nervously at the ship. "That's not it," he muttered. "Go on." Harry nodded and faced Parvati. "Parvati, you haven't gone and told Krum that Ron's Lavender's boyfriend, have you?" Parvati's cheeks flushed. She met Harry's gaze and hurriedly shook her head. "No, of course not." "Good," Harry said, allowing a small smile. He shifted his attention to Lavender. "And you, Lavender, you really shouldn't have mentioned Ron as your boyfriend in that letter to Krum." Lavender's golden hair swung as she huffed. So what? Ron's my friend. He already knows who I am. She crossed her arms defiantly, waiting to see what Harry would say next. Around the lake lay calm and silent, but the tension in their little group promised that the real storm was yet to come. Hermione noticed Ron's expression go suddenly rigid. Hold on, she pressed him. You never even told Krum about us? Ron let out a short, dry laugh. I thought I did, said you were my girlfriend in my last letter, but he still chased after you as if nothing had changed. Harry exhaled in relief, and Neville visibly relaxed beside him. They'd all been ready to label Victor Krum a cad, but it turned out to be nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. Yet another question tugged at them. If Krum really believed Ron was pursuing him, why had he been avoiding Ron ever since? Ron gazed up at the tournament's floating beacons and frowned. To everyone watching, Harry, Neville, even Lavender and Parvati, it had looked like genuine enmity. Krum clearly loathed Ron for some imagined slight. No one had ever contradicted him, partly out of politeness and partly because it seemed awkward to explain that Lavender had only been a decoy in the first place. Harry tapped his chin. Do you think maybe Victor's heard rumors about you and Lavender? If he knows the truth, and if he's too proud or embarrassed to admit it, he might have decided to steer clear. Ron nodded slowly, realizing the tangled web of assumptions could easily have kept Krum at arm's length. Now the real work would be setting the record straight. Neville, Ron, Lavender, and Parvati all nodded in agreement. Sending a letter of apology seemed like the simplest solution. But Ron shook his head, his expression adamant. No, this is something I have to do myself, he said, eyes blazing with determination. Lavender, please don't send that letter. I need to look Victor in the eye and explain it to him in person. He began to pace back and forth, conviction radiating from every step. To Ron, nothing less than a face-to-face conversation would suffice to repair the rift that had formed between him and Krum.